In the far future of the 41st millennium, death is not always the worst fate. To fall into orc hands is to be swallowed by the waagh, a slave, a toy, a tool, living each day only if the greenskins find you useful enough to keep alive. This is not the story of a hero. This is survival inside madness. This is life as a slave in an ork waaagh. They say the Emperor protects. They say faith is our shield, duty our sword, and death our reward. I believed those words once. I carved them into my lasgun stock during the long watches on Tertius Prime. I whispered them when the Xenos came screaming from the smoke. But faith means nothing when you're chained in the belly of an orc truck, breathing the stench of alien sweat and your own terror. The Emperor's light doesn't reach into the depths of a waagh, where humans are currency and suffering is sport. My name was Guardsman Lysander Croak, 47th Tertius Defense Force. But names don't survive what I'm about to tell you. Neither do souls, if I'm being honest. What I became in the green hell of the waagh was something else entirely. Something that clawed and schemed and did unspeakable things just to draw one more breath.
This is the story of how I learned that in the grim darkness of the far future, there are fates worse than death. And sometimes we choose them willingly.
The worst part, by the end, I wasn't sure I wanted to escape anymore. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start with the day I stopped being human and became property of the waagh. The shelling had stopped 3 hours ago, but my ears were still ringing when they dragged me from the rubble of Command Post 7. I should have put my last pistol to my temple the moment I saw those massive green shapes moving through the smoke. Should have. The word that would haunt every moment of what came after. The orc that pulled me from the debris was a monster, 8 feet of scarred muscle and crude metal, with tusks like rusted daggers and eyes that held all the warmth of a plasma core breach. It grinned when it saw I was still breathing, and that grin was somehow worse than any scream of rage could have been. It meant I was worth keeping alive. This one's not all squishy yet, it rumbled in that grinding voice all orcs seem to share. Boss'll want to see what Yumis we got. They stripped me of everything, my flak armor, my weapons, even the small icon of the Emperor I wore around my neck. That last one, they ground under a massive boot while laughing. The sound was like breaking glass in my chest. The march to their camp took 6 hours. 6 hours of stumbling through the ruins of my world, past the corpses of my regiment, while massive orc war trucks belched black smoke and roared like wounded beasts. Other prisoners shuffled alongside me, PDF troopers, a few civilians, even what looked like an Adeptus Mechanicus tech priest, his augmetics sparking and torn. Nobody spoke. What was there to say? We all knew the stories. Orcs didn't take prisoners for prisoner exchanges or intelligence. They took them for entertainment. The war camp was a vision of industrial nightmare sprawled across what had once been the city's trade district. Towering scrap metal structures belched smoke and flame into the ash-choked sky. Massive guns, some clearly looted Imperial ordnance, others grotesque orcish creations, pointed in every direction, like the spines of some colossal beast. And everywhere, was the sound of metal on metal, engines roaring, and that awful orcish laughter that seemed to echo from the very air itself. They herded us into a pen made of welded scrap and razor wire. The stench hit me first, unwashed bodies, infected wounds, and something else. Something like despair made manifest. Inside were dozens of other humans, all in various stages of what I would later learn to recognize as the breaking process. An orc with a whip, they called them run-thirds, I learned later, shoved me forward with the butt of its crude rifle. The pain was nothing compared to what came next, the branding. They heated the iron in a brazier that seemed to burn without any fuel I could identify. The glyph they pressed into my left shoulder was simple, 2 intersecting lines with a circle at the bottom. I screamed until my throat was raw, and through my tears, I could see the other prisoners watching with dead eyes. They had the same mark. We all did now. Umi designation, 47, the Runthard growled, consulting a slate covered in crude orcish glyphs. You keep that number. Forget your squishy name. Names are for boys, not for property. 47. I tried to hold on to Lysander Croak, but the name felt like sand slipping through my fingers. Who was Lysander Croak? A guardsman who'd failed. A man who was now dead. I was 47 now, property of the waagh. That night, as I lay on the cold metal floor of the pen with my brand still weeping, an older prisoner crawled over to me. His eyes had that hollow look I was already learning to fear. The look of someone who had been here far too long. First rule, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant sounds of orcish revelry. Never look them in the eye unless they tell you to. Second rule, always be useful. Never be entertaining. Third rule, he paused, glancing around nervously. The third rule is the hardest. Remember you're human, but never let them see it. The moment they think you've got pride left, they'll spend weeks breaking it out of you. I wanted to ask him how long he'd been here, what his name had been, and whether there was any hope of rescue or escape. But before I could speak, he was already crawling away into the shadows. That's when I heard it for the first time, a sound that would become the soundtrack to every moment that followed. From somewhere deep in the camp came a rhythmic chanting, growing louder and more frenzied with each repetition. Waagh! 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 The sound seemed to make the very air vibrate, and I felt something cold and alien touch my mind, just for an instant. Whatever psychic power drove the orcs, it was stronger here, concentrated by thousands of green-skinned killers, all focused on one thing: violence. As I drifted toward an exhausted sleep, I wondered if the Emperor could even see this place, or if we had passed beyond the light of the Astronomicon into something darker. The last thing I remember thinking before unconsciousness took me was a question that would torment me for months to come. How long could a man remain human in a place designed to strip away everything that made him one? But that was just the beginning. The real education was about to start, and my first lesson would be delivered at the end of a whip. I woke to the sound of screaming. Not human screaming, though there was plenty of that, but the high-pitched shrieking of creatures I'd never heard before. The sun wasn't even up, but the camp was already alive with activity. Up, YA, gits! Time for work! The voice belonged to our Runthard, a scarred brute they called Scarfang. His right tusk had been broken off in some fight, leaving a jagged stump that he seemed to use as an additional weapon when disciplining prisoners. The whip in his massive hands was made of some kind of alien leather studded with metal barbs. Around us, smaller green creatures, Gretchen, or grots as they were more commonly called, scurried between the prisoners, kicking and prodding with crude sticks. They were barely 3 feet tall, but what they lacked in size, they made up for in vicious cunning. And they seemed to take particular pleasure in tormenting the human slaves. One of them, its face a map of scars and malice, grinned up at me with needle-sharp teeth. Look at this one, Scarfang. Still got some fight in his eyes, he does. The whip caught me across the back before I could react, sending me to my knees. The barbs tore through my torn uniform and into flesh, and I bit my tongue hard enough to taste blood rather than cry out. 47 doesn't look at grots unless grots tell him to look, Scarfang rumbled. First lesson in staying alive, Umi. Grots may be small, but they're still greener than you. That makes them your betters. The hierarchy was becoming clear. Orcs at the top, grots below them but still above us, and humans at the very bottom. Lower than animals, because at least squigs had entertainment value. They marched us out of the pen in a ragged column, past structures that hurt to look at directly. Everything the orcs built seemed wrong somehow. Angles that didn't quite make sense. Proportions that made my eyes water. It was as if they built by instinct rather than engineering. And that instinct came from somewhere fundamentally alien. Our first work assignment was in what they called the Munitorum, their ammunition storage and distribution center. It was a sprawling complex of interconnected buildings, each one packed floor to ceiling with shells, bullets, and explosives of every conceivable type. Most of it was looted Imperial ordnance, but there were orc creations too. Crude shells with flames painted on them, bullets that were more like tiny rockets, and stranger things that seemed to pulse with their own malevolent energy. Your job is simple, Scarfang announced, cracking his whip for emphasis. Move the shells from here to there. Don't drop them. Don't ask questions. Don't think. Just lift, carry, and try not to die. The shells were heavier than they looked, and after my first hour of hauling ammunition that could level city blocks, my back was on fire, and my hands were bleeding from the rough metal casings. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the grots. They followed us everywhere, commenting on our work, our appearance, our obvious inadequacies. They seemed to have an instinctive understanding of what would hurt us most, psychologically speaking. The scarred one that had singled me out earlier, I heard the others call him Snickgit, took particular delight in describing what various weapons would do to human flesh. See that one there? He pointed to a shell the size of a small barrel. That's a burner bomb. Goes off in a great big whoosh of flame. Cooks you from the inside out, it does. Makes you smell like roast groks for days after you're dead. But it was worse when they talked about home. Somehow they'd learned fragments about our lives before capture, probably from interrogating other prisoners. Snicket knew I'd been stationed on Tertius Prime. He knew about the agri-domes and the crystal formations that made our world famous across the sector. Heard your rock got a real nice glowing after we was done with it, he chittered. All those pretty crystals melted down really well. Bet your Yumi friends made lovely screaming sounds when the glass started raining down. I almost hit him then. The rage built in my chest like molten metal, and for a moment I could see myself wrapping my hands around his scrawny throat. But then I remembered the older prisoner's words, never be entertainment. Scarfang was watching me carefully, his small red eyes gleaming with anticipation. He wanted me to snap. He wanted an excuse to make an example of me. So instead, I picked up another shell and kept walking. Smart Yumi, the Runthard grunted, sounding almost disappointed. The day stretched on forever. Hauling ammunition gave way to cleaning out squig pens, and I learned that squigs were even worse than they sounded. They were fungal creatures, somewhere between plant and animal, that the orcs used for everything from food to weapons. The food squigs weren't too bad, just squishy and foul-smelling, but the attack squigs were nightmares with teeth. Picture a ball of muscle the size of a washing machine, covered in chitinous plates and sporting a mouth that was essentially a circular saw made of fangs. They bounced around their pens like deadly rubber balls, occasionally taking chunks out of the walls just for fun, and we were supposed to clean around them. Just don't make any sudden movements, advised another prisoner, a woman I hadn't seen before. She had the hollow look of long captivity, but her voice still held traces of authority. They're faster than they look, and they'll bite anything that moves wrong. "What's your designation?" I asked quietly, as we mucked out squig droppings with crude shovels. 63, she replied. Used to be Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Vex, 12th Morton Rifles. Been here 8 months now. You learn to stop counting after a while. 8 months. The number hit me like a physical blow. 8 months of this. I'd been imagining rescue, planning escape, holding on to hope that this was temporary. But 8 months. How many others have been here that long? I asked. She was quiet for so long, I thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, I'm the longest. Most don't last more than a few months. It's not the work that kills them. It's the hope. Before I could ask what she meant, Snicket was back, brandishing his stick and grinning that awful grin. Oi, 63, you know better than to chat during work time. That's 5 lashes for you, and 5 for your new friend too. The whip was worse the second time, because I knew it was coming. But as I knelt in the squig muck, bleeding and trying not to vomit from the pain, I realized something important. This wasn't random cruelty. This was training. They were teaching us that any connection to our fellow prisoners would be punished. Any sign of humanity, any attempt to maintain the bonds that made us more than just animals, would result in pain. Not just for us, but for anyone we tried to connect with. It was elegant in its way, brutally efficient. That night, back in our pen, I lay awake listening to the sounds of the camp. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the orcs singing, if you could call it singing. It was more like organized roaring, punctuated by the crash of metal on metal and occasional explosions that seemed to be part of the rhythm. But closer, much closer, I could hear something else. Quiet sobbing. Someone is trying very hard not to be heard, but failing. The sound went on for hours, and I never did figure out where it was coming from. In the morning, there were only 42 prisoners in our pen instead of 43. No one mentioned it. No one asked where the missing person had gone, because we all understood now that curiosity, like hope, was a luxury we couldn't afford. As I drifted towards sleep, I wondered how long it would be before I stopped hearing the sobbing and started making those sounds myself. The thought followed me into dreams, filled with green faces and the crack of whips. But my education in the hierarchy of the waagh was far from over. Tomorrow would bring me face to face with the beating heart of orc civilization, the mechyard, where machinery and madness danced together in a symphony of barely controlled chaos. The mechyard was where orc engineering met orc imagination, and the results were as terrifying as they were impossible. Sprawling across several acres of what had once been a residential district, it was a maze of workshops, forges, and testing grounds where the laws of physics went to die screaming. They assigned me to Workshop 17, under the supervision of a mech boy called Sludgegut. If Scarfang had been intimidating, Sludgegut was apocalyptic. Half his body had been replaced with crude mechanical parts that leaked oil and sparked at random intervals. His left arm was a massive pneumatic claw, and his right eye was a telescoping lens assembly that whirred and clicked as it focused. When he spoke, his voice came through a vocabulator that made every word sound like a death threat. "Right then, you new groats and you maze," he bellowed as we were herded into his domain. "This is where we make the good stuff. The shooty stuff, the explodey stuff. And if you're very, very stupid, you'll become the squishy stuff that gets scraped off the walls." The workshop was a cathedral of mechanical insanity. Conveyor belts moved half-assembled weapons past workstations where grots and slaves labored under the watchful eyes of orc mechs. Overhead, massive crane systems shifted raw materials and finished products with casual disregard for anyone standing beneath them. And everywhere, the smell of burning metal, ozone, and something that might have been blood. My first job was simple enough, holding pieces of scrap metal while a grot named Woozgut welded them together. The torch he used was clearly Imperial manufacture, but it had been modified with so many orcish additions that it barely resembled its original form. Flames erupted from it at random intervals, and I quickly learned to flinch away whenever I heard the telltale hiss that preceded an explosion. "Hold still, you git," Woozgut snarled as I jerked away from a particularly violent flame burst. "How am I supposed to weld this if you keep moving about? Maybe if you didn't use a torch that's trying to kill me," I muttered under my breath. Wrong thing to say. Woozgut's eyes lit up with malicious glee, and he immediately started shouting for Sludgegut. Within seconds, the massive mech boy was looming over me, his mechanical eye whirring as it focused on my face. "Dis Yumi says my torch is broken," Woozgut tattled. "Says it's trying to kill him." Sludgegut's vocabulator crackled with what might have been laughter. "Is date so? Well, let's test that theory, shall we?" What followed was my introduction to Ork quality control. They strapped me to a chair in the testing area, a cleared space surrounded by blast shields and what looked suspiciously like betting booths, and proceeded to test various workshop creations on me. First up was something called a shooter-scope, apparently a targeting device that was supposed to help orcs aim better. They bolted it to my head and had me look at targets while grots fired practice rounds past my ears. The device worked, sort of, but it also generated enough heat to leave burns on my scalp and occasionally delivered electric shocks that made my teeth ache. "Interesting," Sludgegut mused, making notes on a slate covered in crude diagrams. "The Ume brain seems to make it work better. Maybe we should add more Ume bits to the design." Then came the Stomper boot, massive metal foot coverings that were supposed to increase the wearer's speed and jumping ability. They forced me to put them on and run across a field while grots threw rocks at me. The boots did make me faster, but they also felt like they were going to crush my feet into paste, and the servos that powered them occasionally locked up completely, leaving me immobilized while the rocks continued to fly. But the worst was something they called a pain glove. It looked innocuous enough, just a simple mechanical gauntlet covered in sensors and small devices. But when they slipped it onto my hand, it came alive with malicious purpose. Tiny needles pricked my skin at random intervals. Electric coils delivered shocks of varying intensity, and small vices closed on my fingers with enough force to make me scream. "The idea," Sludgegut explained with obvious pride, "is that the more pain the wearer feels, the stronger he gets. Pain makes you mad, and mad makes you fight better." The glove stayed on for 3 hours. 3 hours of constant random agony that left me sobbing and begging for relief, but it worked in a way. By the end, I was so consumed with rage that I probably could have torn someone apart with my bare hands if they'd let me. When they finally removed it, my hand was a mess of puncture wounds and electrical burns. But Sludgegut seemed pleased with the results. "Very good. Dawumi pain response is much better than grot pain response. We'll use Yumis for all future testing," it shouts. That night, as I lay in the pen cradling my injured hand, I tried to process what I'd experienced. The orcs weren't just cruel, they were creatively cruel. Their entire technological philosophy seemed based on the principle that if something didn't work, you made it bigger, louder, and more dangerous until it either worked or exploded spectacularly. But there was something else. Something that bothered me more than the physical pain. During those 3 hours in the pain glove, I had felt something change inside me. The constant agony had awakened something primal and vicious, something that enjoyed the thought of inflicting the same suffering on others. For a few moments there, I hadn't been thinking about escape or rescue or even survival. I'd been thinking about revenge, about what I would do to Sludgegut, Wuzgut and Snigget if I ever got the chance. And those thoughts had felt good, natural, and right. Those thoughts were the most terrifying thing of all. Not that they were torturing me, but that the torture was changing me into something that could enjoy torturing others. The woman from the ammunition detail, 63, had mentioned that hope was what killed most prisoners. But I was beginning to understand that it wasn't hope that was the real danger. It was the gradual realization that you were becoming something that deserved this treatment. The next morning brought a new horror to add to my growing collection. I was assigned to assist with grot testing, apparently a regular part of the workshop routine, where grots volunteered, or were volunteered, to test new equipment and weapons. The volunteers rarely survived, but there was never a shortage of them. You see, explained a grot named Niblet as we prepared the latest batch of test subjects, it's an honor to die for Demex. Shows you got proper orky spirit, even if you are just a grot. The first volunteer was strapped into something called a flying squig launcher, which was essentially a massive slingshot designed to hurl attack squigs at enemy positions. The grot was supposed to ride the squig to direct its landing, but the calibration was clearly off. Instead of launching in a graceful arc toward the target, grot and squig exploded out of the device at impossible speed, screamed across the testing ground, and impacted against the far wall with a wet thud that echoed through the entire workshop. The watching orcs cheered appreciatively. Sludgegut made notes about increasing the launch velocity. The second volunteer tested a Daka gun, which is a rapid-fire weapon that fired so fast it required constant cooling to prevent meltdown. The volunteer lasted about 30 seconds before the gun's heat exchanger failed and cooked him from the inside out. The smell was indescribable. More cheering, more notes, and more volunteers are stepping forward. By the fourth test, I was actively fighting the urge to vomit. But what made it worse was the reaction of the other slaves. Some watched with the same horrified fascination I felt, but others were laughing. Quiet, desperate laughter that sounded more like sobbing, but laughter nonetheless. They were finding humor in the suffering because it wasn't their suffering, because for once, they weren't the ones being torn apart for orc entertainment. And that realization that I could understand that laughter, that part of me wanted to join in, was almost more than I could bear. As we cleaned up the remains of the day's testing, orcs never bothered with such mundane tasks themselves. I caught sight of my reflection in a piece of polished metal. What I saw made me stop cold. The face looking back at me wasn't entirely human anymore. The eyes were too bright, too alert. The mouth was set in a thin line that suggested someone who had learned to find amusement in terrible things. And there was something in the expression, a calculating quality, that reminded me uncomfortably of Snigget's grin. How long had I been here? 3 days? 4? It felt like months, but I knew it couldn't have been that long. Yet already I could feel myself changing, adapting, becoming something that could survive in this green hell. The question was, would whatever survived still be worth saving? But my education in the ways of the waagh was just beginning. Soon I would learn about the food chain that governed every aspect of life in the camp, and discover that hunger could be an even crueler master than any Runthard's whip. They fed us twice a day, if you could call it feeding. The meals were distributed in what had once been a warehouse, now converted into a feeding hall that could accommodate hundreds of slaves and grots at once. The smell hit you long before you saw the food, a mixture of rotting vegetation, rancid meat, and something distinctly fungal that made your stomach churn even as it growled with hunger. The system was elegantly simple in its cruelty. All food went into a central vat the size of a Lehman Russ tank, where it was stirred into an undifferentiated grey-green sludge. Grots got the first serving, ladled from the top, where any actual nutrients might be found. Slaves got whatever remained, served from the bottom where sediment and refuse settled. But even among the slaves, there was hierarchy. New meat goes last, growled a prisoner I hadn't seen before. A massive man with ritual scars covering his arms and the distinctive tattoos of a Katishan jungle fighter. His designation was 12, and he'd somehow managed to maintain enough muscle mass to suggest he was getting better food than the rest of us. Work your way up, earn your place at the trough. The trough was literal, a long metal container where the slave rations were dumped. No bowls, no utensils, just hands and mouths and desperate hunger. The first slaves to reach it got the pieces that were still recognizable as food. The last got liquid that was more like soup made from despair. I learned quickly that mealtimes weren't just about nutrition. They were about power, politics, and survival. The stronger slaves formed loose alliances, sharing information and protecting each other from the worst of the Grot's harassment. The weaker ones, well, they learned to eat quickly or go hungry. Sniget seemed to take particular pleasure in disrupting the feeding process. He would walk along the trough with his stick, occasionally knocking slaves away from their meals or stirring the contents just to watch the desperate scramble that followed. "Oops!" he chittered as he swept my cupped hands away from a particularly solid piece of what might have been squig meat. Clumsy me. Guess 47 doesn't get that bit after all. The rage was instant and overwhelming. I could feel my muscles tensing, my hands forming fists. For a moment, I was back in the pain glove, consumed with the desire to hurt something, to make it pay for hurting me. Sniget saw it too, and his grin widened. "Go on then," he whispered, just loud enough for me to hear. "Take a swing. I dare ya." It was a trap, and I knew it. Any violence against a grot would result in punishment that would make the pain glove seem like a gentle massage. But knowing it was a trap didn't make the anger go away. If anything, the helplessness made it worse. That's when 12 intervened. Without saying a word, he scooped up a portion of his own ration and dropped it in front of me. It wasn't much, a few chunks of unidentifiable protein and some fungal matter that might have been edible, but it was food I hadn't had to fight for. "Eat," he said quietly. "Build strength. Strength keeps you alive." Sniget lost interest once the entertainment value dried up, wandering off to torment someone else. But I didn't miss the calculating look in his eyes. He would remember this kindness, and he would find a way to punish it later. The food itself was indescribable. Imagine everything you've ever thrown away because it was too rotten to eat, mixed with alien fungus and possibly some things that were still moving. The taste was somewhere between decay and copper, with an aftertaste that lingered for hours. But it was calories, and calories meant survival. "You get used to it," said 63, settling beside me with her own portion. "After a few weeks, you stop tasting it at all. Your body just processes it as fuel." "What is it exactly?" I asked, trying not to look too closely at something that appeared to have eyes. "Best not to ask," advised another prisoner, an older man with the pale complexion of a hive welder. "I saw them preparing it once. You don't want to know." But I did want to know. Understanding the enemy meant understanding their methods, their resources, and their weaknesses. So I started paying attention during our work details, noting where the food came from and how it was processed. The answer was worse than I'd imagined. The orcs grew their own food supply in vast fungal gardens that sprawled beneath the camp. The fungi were genetically engineered, if you could call orc biomanipulation engineering, to grow quickly and produce maximum calories with minimum care. They fed on organic waste of all kinds, including the bodies of slaves who didn't survive the work details. I made this discovery during my 3rd week in the mechyard, when I was assigned to carry what I thought were scrap materials to the fungal gardens. The scrap materials turned out to be the remains of a prisoner who had been caught in a machinery accident, wrapped in metal sheeting and destined to become fertilizer for our next meal. The grots supervising the delivery found my horror hilarious. "That's right, Yumi," cackled the one in charge. "Round and round it goes. You eat the fungus, fungus eats you. New Umis eat the new fungus. Very efficient, very orky." He rambled with excitement. That night, I couldn't eat at all. The thought of consuming something that had grown from the decomposed remains of my fellow prisoners made my stomach rebel violently. I sat at the trough, staring at the grey-green sludge, and felt something break inside me. But hunger is a cruel master, and by the next evening, I was eating again. Because the alternative was joining the fungal gardens myself, and whatever was left of Lysander Croak wasn't ready to surrender that completely. The politics of mealtimes became clearer as I learned to navigate them. 12 had claimed me as part of his group, not out of kindness, but because he'd recognized something in me that might be useful. My Tertius Prime accent marked me as educated, possibly officer material, in the weird mathematics of survival that made me worth protecting. "Information is currency here," he explained during one of our careful conversations. "Know which mechs are planning new projects. Know which grots are looking for volunteers. Know which slaves are getting sick and won't last the week." His group numbered 7 former Guardsmen, PDF troopers, even a Navy rating who claimed to have served on a cruiser. They shared food, shared intelligence, and most importantly, they shared the burden of staying human in a place that seemed designed to strip away humanity bit by bit. But they also shared something else, a cold pragmatism that was both reassuring and terrifying. When one of the newer prisoners started showing signs of mental breakdown, talking to invisible friends, and laughing at inappropriate times, they quietly excluded him from the group. Not cruelly, but efficiently. "Can't help him," 12 stated flatly when I questioned the decision. "He's already gone, just hasn't died yet. Staying close to him means the grots will associate us with instability. That gets people to volunteer for the testing programs." I understood the logic, but that didn't make it easier to watch the man spiral further into madness. Within a week, he was volunteering for increasingly dangerous assignments, seeking death with the dedication of a zealot. The orcs were happy to oblige him. What disturbed me most wasn't his death. By that point, I'd seen dozens of prisoners die in various horrible ways. What disturbed me was how easily I'd accepted the group's decision to abandon him, how quickly I'd learned to think like them, to calculate the survival value of every action and relationship. The transformation was subtle but inexorable. Each day in the feeding hall taught me new lessons about power, hierarchy, and the price of compassion. I learned which slaves to avoid because their desperation made them unpredictable. I learned which grots could be bribed with extra work to earn small favors. I learned that sometimes the cruelest thing you could do to someone was give them hope. A new prisoner arrived during my 4th week, a young woman, barely out of training by the look of her uniform remnants. She'd been a communications operator, she told me during her first meal, part of a planetary defense network that had tried to call for Imperial reinforcements. The call had gone out, she insisted. Help was coming. I wanted to tell her the truth, that no help was coming, that even if it was, we'd likely be dead long before it arrived. The sooner she accepted her situation, the better her chances of surviving it. But 12 caught my eye and shook his head slightly. "Let her keep the dream a while longer," he murmured later. "She'll work harder if she thinks it's temporary. When reality hits, we'll see what's left of her." 3 days later, she volunteered for a testing assignment that everyone knew was suicide. Something about riding a rocket-powered attack bike that had already killed 4 grots in preliminary trials. She died screaming Hail Marys and calling for the Emperor's protection, still believing that rescue was just around the corner. That night, as we divided up her meager possessions according to camp protocol, I realized I felt nothing. No grief, no anger, no guilt about not warning her. She had made her choice, and choices had consequences. That was the logic of the war, as inescapable as gravity. But the most horrifying part of the food chain wasn't what we ate. It was what the eating turned us into. Every meal was a small betrayal of everything we'd once believed about human dignity and mutual aid. Every time we fought over scraps while others went hungry, every time we hoarded resources while weaker prisoners starved, we took another step away from whatever we'd been before. I tried to hold on to some small shred of moral principle, some line I wouldn't cross. But the lines kept moving. First, I wouldn't take food from someone weaker. Then I wouldn't take much food. Then I wouldn't take food unless I really needed it. By the end of my first month, I was taking food from whoever couldn't stop me, just like everyone else. The most damning thing was how normal it felt, how quickly brutal pragmatism became second nature. The old me, Guardsman Lysander Croak, would have been horrified by what 47 was becoming. But Guardsman Lysander Croak was dead, and had been from the moment they pressed that brand into my shoulder. But food was just one part of the ecosystem of survival. Soon I would learn about another crucial element of camp life, the squig pits, where life and death danced together in a symphony of teeth and terror, and where I would discover that even the simplest tasks could become exercises in existential horror. The squig pits were where the orcs kept their livestock, and the term livestock covered a bewildering variety of creatures that defied every law of biology I thought I understood. Some were clearly bred for food, bloated, docile things that looked like mushrooms with faces. Others were weapons waiting to happen, all teeth and rage and barely contained violence. And a few seemed to exist purely to make you question the sanity of a universe that could produce such things. They assigned me to Pit 7 on my 5th week, working under a grot handler named Snot Guzzler, who had somehow survived long enough to become something approaching competent. He wore a coat of patches and scars that told the story of countless encounters with things that wanted to eat him, and his missing left eye suggested he wasn't always successful at avoiding those encounters. "Right then, 47, he said, pointing at me with a rod that sparked with electrical energy. "Your job is simple. Feed the squigs, clean the pits, try not to get eaten. The last you me what worked this pit lasted 2 days before a face-eater squig got him. Let's see if you can beat that record." The face-eater squig in question was currently pressed against the bars of its cage, making a sound like a buzzsaw having an argument with a dental drill. It was roughly the size of a basketball, covered in chitinous plates, and sporting a mouth that opened like a flower to reveal rings of rotating teeth. When it saw me looking, it made what I can only describe as a purring sound and started salivating. "That one likes you," Snot Guzzler observed with obvious amusement. "Good sign. Means you got proper fear smell. Makes 'em hungry." The feeding process was an exercise in controlled terror. Each type of squig required different food. Some ate fungus, others preferred meat, and a few seemed to sustain themselves purely on malevolence. The trick was getting the food into their containers without losing any appendages in the process. The food squigs were easy enough. You could practically fall asleep while feeding them, and several prisoners had. But the attack squigs were different. They were intelligent enough to plan, patient enough to wait, and vicious enough to hold grudges. They would watch you work, memorizing your patterns, looking for the moment when your guard was down. I learned this the hard way during my first week in the pits. I was feeding something called a bomb squig, which is a living grenade that the orcs trained to run at enemies and explode on command. It looked harmless enough, about the size of a large dog, but round and seemingly docile. The feeding instructions were simple. Drop the fungus pellets through a slot in the top of the cage, step back, and wait for it to finish eating. What the instructions didn't mention was that bomb squigs could jump, or that they could time their jumps to coincide with the feeding schedule, or that they found the sight of terrified humans absolutely hilarious. The thing launched itself at me just as I was closing the feeding slot, hitting the bars with enough force to shake the entire cage. I stumbled backward, tripped over a bucket of squig droppings, and went down hard. The bomb squig pressed its face against the bars and made a sound that was unmistakably laughter. "First lesson," called out another prisoner, a man designated 89 who'd been working the pits for months. "They're not just animals, they're comedians, very violent, hungry comedians." As I picked myself up, covered in squig excrement and struggling to maintain what was left of my dignity, I could hear laughter from all around the pit complex. Not just from the squigs, though several of them were amused, but from the grots, and even a few of my fellow prisoners. My humiliation was entertainment for everyone. But the real education came when I was assigned to help with squig maintenance, which is the process of keeping the creatures healthy, well-groomed, and properly trained. It was here that I began to understand the true horror of what the orcs had created. The squigs weren't just bred, they were designed, engineered at some fundamental level to be exactly what the orcs needed them to be. And what the orcs needed was creatures that embodied their own philosophy: violence as art, destruction as expression, pain as communication. The hair squigs, for instance, they looked like harmless balls of fluff, but their fur was actually thousands of microscopic needles that could inject toxins or simply cause agonizing irritation. The orcs used them as living wigs, enjoying the constant low-level pain as a form of stimulation. The musical squigs were worse. They produced sound by inflating air sacs in their bodies, but the music they created was specifically tuned to frequencies that cause psychological distress in most sentient species. Extended exposure could drive you insane, which the orcs considered a delightful bonus feature. And then there were the mirror squigs. I encountered my first mirror squig during my second week in the pits. It was in a cage by itself, segregated from the other creatures, and covered with a heavy tarp. Snot Guzzler's instructions were specific: feed it, clean around it, but never, ever look directly at it. "Why?" I asked, immediately regretting the question. "Because that's what it wants," he replied, his voice dropping to an uncharacteristic whisper. "That's what it's for. Looking. And once you look, well, let's just say the last grot, what looked don't talk much anymore. Just sits in the corner making funny noises and wetting himself." Curiosity, as I'd learned, was a dangerous luxury in the waagh, but it was also irresistible. For days, I worked around that covered cage, feeding the thing inside, hearing its soft movements and occasional whispers. Yes, whispers. Mirror squigs could apparently speak, after a fashion, and wondering what could be so terrible about looking at it. The opportunity came during my third week, when Snot Guzzler was called away to deal with an escape attempt in Pit 3. I was alone with the creatures, following my routine, when I heard it speak. "Hello, 47. I froze. None of the squigs had ever used my designation before. They made noise, certainly, but never anything that sounded like actual words. And the voice sounded familiar. "I know you want to look," it continued, and now I was certain it sounded like my voice. Just a quick peek. What harm could it do? My hands were shaking as I reached for the edge of the tarp. Every instinct I had was screaming warnings, but the voice was so reasonable, so persuasive. It sounded exactly like the voice in my head that had gotten me through basic training, through my first combat deployment, through every difficult decision I'd ever made. "That's right," the voice encouraged. "Just lift the corner. Just for a second. You need to know, don't you? You've always needed to know." I lifted the tarp. The thing inside wasn't quite a squig, and it wasn't quite a mirror. It was something in between, a writhing mass of reflective flesh that showed you not what you looked like, but what you were becoming. And what I saw staring back at me was a creature I barely recognized. The face was mine, but wrong. The eyes were too bright, too eager, with the calculating look I'd noticed in my reflection weeks ago. The mouth was curved in a permanent half-smile that suggested someone who found amusement in others' pain. And there was something else, a quality of emptiness, as if something essential had been scooped out and replaced with careful mimicry of human emotion. But worse than the image was the recognition, because I knew with horrible certainty that what I was seeing wasn't what I might become. It was what I already was. The mirror squig didn't show possibilities. It showed truth. I dropped the tarp and stumbled backward, but it was too late. The damage was done. For the rest of that day, and indeed for days afterward, I found myself thinking about that image. Not with horror, as I should have, but with a kind of fascination. Was that really what I looked like to others now? Was that the face I showed when I calculated the survival value of helping a fellow prisoner, or when I watched someone else's suffering with detached interest? When Snot Guzzler returned and saw my expression, he just shook his head sadly. "Told you not to look," he muttered. "Mirror squigs always get curious yumis. Show you things you ain't ready to see." "What did it show you?" I asked. His laugh was bitter and entirely ungrot-like. "Same thing. It shows everyone who looks. Da truth." That night, back in our pen, I found myself studying the faces of my fellow prisoners with new eyes. How many of them had seen their own reflections in that mirror squig, or one like it? How many had recognized the thing they were becoming and made peace with it? The answer, I realized with growing certainty, was all of them. Every survivor in the camp had looked into that mirror at some point, literally or figuratively, and decided that whatever they saw was preferable to death. We were all monsters now, just monsters with enough self-awareness to feel guilty about it. But guilt, like hope, was a luxury we couldn't afford, so we did what we had to do, and we found ways to live with it. And sometimes, in the small hours of the night, when the orcs' snoring shook the camp, and the distant sounds of violence provided a lullaby, we almost convinced ourselves that we were still human. But my education in the ways of the waagh was far from complete. Soon, I would witness something that would shake my understanding of reality itself, the ritual power that bound the orcs together and drove their endless crusade of violence across the stars. The first time I witnessed a proper waagh ritual, I thought I was losing my mind. The sound started just after sunset, a low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to rise from the very ground beneath the camp. At first, it was just a few voices, scattered across the sprawling complex of workshops and barracks. But it grew. Emperor preserve me, how it grew. Within minutes, the chant had spread to encompass the entire camp. Thousands of orc voices raised in unison, creating a sound that was less music than it was a force of nature. The metal structures around us began to vibrate in sympathy, and I swear I could feel my teeth loosening in my jaw from the sheer acoustic pressure. Waagh, waagh, waagh. But it wasn't just sound. There was something else riding along with the voices, something that pressed against my mind like invisible hands, trying to reshape my thoughts to match the rhythm of the chant. Whatever psychic force powered the orcs was strongest during these rituals, focused and amplified by their collective will. They herded us out of our pens to witness the ceremony, not out of kindness, but because our terror apparently added something to the experience. The gathering took place in what had once been the city's main plaza, now converted into a crude amphitheater surrounded by towering totems made from scavenged vehicles and decorated with skulls of various species. At the center of it all was the Weird Boy. I'd heard about Weird Boys from the other prisoners, orcs who channeled the psychic energy of the waagh and used it to devastating effect in battle, but seeing one in person was indescribable. The creature was massive even by orc standards, its skull bulging with unnatural growths that pulsed with greenish light. Crude cables and devices had been grafted directly into its brain, sparking and smoking as they struggled to contain the psychic energies flowing through them. Around the Weird Boy, arranged in concentric circles, were hundreds of grots and smaller orcs. But these weren't the relatively normal specimens I'd grown accustomed to in the workshops. These were something else. Their eyes rolled back to show only whites, their mouths hanging open as they swayed to the rhythm of the chant. Some were bleeding from their ears or noses, but they seemed unaware of their injuries. "Beautiful, ain't it?" whispered Snicket, appearing beside me with that awful grin. "The Weird Boy's gonna show us the future of the waagh, all the lovely battles to come, all the Yumi worlds we's gonna stomp." The chanting reached a crescendo, and suddenly the Weird Boy's eyes snapped open, glowing with the same greenish light that emanated from the growths on his skull. When he spoke, his voice carried across the entire plaza without amplification, seeming to resonate inside our skulls rather than through our ears. "I see the great crushing," he bellowed, raising his arms toward the smoke-choked sky. "I see Yumi worlds burning like candles. I see their fancy ships breaking apart in the void." The assembled orcs roared their approval, and I felt something cold touch my spine, because I could see it too. Glimpses of burning cities, of massive space battles, of entire worlds consumed by green-skinned armies. The images flickered at the edge of my vision like half-remembered dreams, but they felt real. More real than the plaza around me, more real than my own memories. "The Emperor's little toy soldiers will run before us," the Weird Boy continued, his voice rising to an inhuman shriek. "Their prayers will turn to screams. Their screams will turn to silence." More images flooded my mind. Imperial Guard regiments being overrun, Space Marine strongholds falling to endless waves of orc attackers, entire sectors going dark as the waagh rolled over them like a green tsunami, and through it all, the sound of laughter, orcish laughter that seemed to echo from the stars themselves. But the worst part wasn't the visions of destruction. It was the joy, the pure, uncomplicated happiness that radiated from every orc in the plaza as they contemplated the slaughter to come. They weren't just planning to destroy civilization. They were looking forward to it, with the enthusiasm of children anticipating a festival. The ritual continued for hours, with the Weird Boy channeling vision after vision of conquest and carnage. Some of the images were clearly fantasies, battles against enemies I didn't recognize, weapons that defied belief even by orc standards. But others had the terrible clarity of prophecy, and I found myself wondering how much of what I was seeing was inevitable future rather than wishful thinking. As the night wore on, some of the grots began to collapse. The psychic energy flowing through the gathering was too much for their smaller minds to handle, and they simply shut down like overloaded circuits. The other orcs paid no attention to their fallen comrades, too lost in the visions to care about individual casualties. But it was the effect on the human prisoners that truly terrified me. All around me, I could see my fellow slaves swaying to the rhythm of the chant, their eyes glazing over as the Weird Boy's visions took hold. Some were nodding along with the prophecies of destruction, unconsciously agreeing with predictions of their own species' annihilation. And I realized I was doing it too. The visions were seductive in their clarity, their certainty. After months of uncertainty and suffering, there was something almost comforting about seeing a future where all the struggle and pain had meaning, even if that meaning was the complete destruction of everything I'd once held dear. When the ritual finally ended, we were marched back to our pens in silence. But the silence wasn't empty. It was pregnant with possibility, heavy with the weight of shared vision. The orcs had shown us the future they were building, and against all reason, part of me wanted to see it come to pass. That night, as I lay on the cold metal floor listening to the distant sounds of celebration, I tried to understand what had happened to me. The visions had felt real, but they had also felt alien, as if I was experiencing someone else's dreams. Yet they had stirred something in me, some buried part that responded to the promise of absolute destruction with something uncomfortably close to anticipation. "Did you see it too?" whispered a voice in the darkness. It was 63, the former lieutenant colonel who had been here longer than anyone. "See what? The end of everything. The final battle. The moment when there's nothing left but orcs and silence." I didn't answer immediately, but eventually I nodded, forgetting that she couldn't see me in the darkness. "Yes," I whispered back. "I saw it. Beautiful, wasn't it?" Her voice held a note of wonder that made my blood run cold. Clean, simple, no more moral complexity, no more difficult choices, just the strong consuming the weak until only the strongest remains. "That's not beautiful," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it though? Think about it, 47. All of human history is just variations on the same theme: conflict, suffering, and brief periods of peace before the next war begins. What the orcs offer is honesty, pure, undiluted violence without pretense or justification. At least they're honest about what they are." Her words haunted me through the remainder of the night, because there was truth in them, even if it was a twisted, horrible truth. The Imperium I had served claimed to fight for humanity's survival, but it had ground up billions of lives in pursuit of that goal. The orcs, at least, didn't pretend their violence served any higher purpose than their own amusement. By morning, I had reached a disturbing conclusion. The ritual hadn't changed me. It had simply revealed something that was already there, a seed of darkness that had been growing since my first day in captivity. The weird boy's visions hadn't corrupted me. They had simply shown me a corruption that was already complete. But visions of future conquest were just one aspect of the orcs' relationship with violence. Soon, I would witness their approach to more immediate gratification, the distribution of the spoils of war, and the casual cruelty with which they treated the symbols of everything I had once held sacred. The war party returned on a Tuesday. Not that days had much meaning in the green hell of the waagh, but some part of me still kept track of the passage of time. It was a desperate attempt to maintain some connection to the ordered universe I'd once inhabited, even as that universe grew more distant with each passing hour. They announced their arrival long before they came into view. The sound of engines, poorly maintained and pushed beyond all reasonable limits, echoed across the camp like mechanical thunder. But it wasn't just the vehicles. It was the singing. Hundreds of orc voices raised in victory songs that spoke of glorious battle and magnificent destruction. We were dragged from our work details to witness the parade, lined up along the main thoroughfare like spectators at some grotesque celebration. The grots were almost beside themselves with excitement, chattering and pointing as the first vehicles came into view. Leading the procession was a battle wagon the size of a building, its armor plates decorated with fresh kill markings and streaming banners made from the flayed skin of its enemies. Mounted on its front like a trophy was the severed head of what had once been an imperial knight, one of those massive war machines that represented the pinnacle of human military technology, now reduced to a gruesome ornament. But it was what followed that truly broke something inside me. Truck after truck rolled past, loaded with the spoils of conquest, weapons, armor, vehicles, all bearing the symbols of the Imperium I had served. But mixed in with the military hardware were other things, civilian items, personal effects, the accumulated treasures of lives now ended. I saw children's toys welded to the sides of orc vehicles like twisted decorations, family portraits used as gun shields, wedding rings fashioned into crude jewelry for grot overseers. Every item told a story of a life interrupted, a future denied, a small piece of human hope transformed into alien amusement. "Look at that," Snicket chittered, pointing at a particularly grotesque display. "They got a whole cathedral bell. Gonna turn it into a shooting gun, they are." The bell in question was a massive bronze thing that must have taken dozens of orcs to move. It had been the heart of some Imperial Shrine World's main cathedral, where thousands had gathered to hear its call to prayer. Now it would be bored out and converted into artillery, its sacred purpose perverted into an instrument of destruction. But the vehicles were just the opening act. What came next was the real horror. The prisoners. They were chained together in long lines, hundreds of them, stumbling along behind the war wagons like broken toys. Men, women, children, all bearing the glazed expression of the newly captured, still in shock from whatever battle had claimed their world. They wore the remnants of civilian clothes, PDF uniforms, and even a few Imperial Navy ratings who must have been caught when their ship was boarded. I found myself scanning their faces, looking for someone I might recognize from my previous life. It was a pointless exercise. The galaxy was vast, and the chances of encountering anyone from Tertius Prime were essentially zero. But I couldn't stop myself from searching, hoping against hope for some connection to the man I used to be. What I found instead was worse than nothing. In the face of a young woman near the back of one column, I saw something I recognized all too well. The particular expression of someone who still believed rescue was possible, who still thought this was temporary, who still had hope. She reminded me of the communications officer who had died on the rocket bike, and I felt a stab of something that might have been empathy or might have been hunger, because I knew exactly what that hope would cost her, and part of me was already anticipating the entertainment value of watching it die. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't looking at the new prisoners with compassion or solidarity. I was looking at them with the same calculating interest that Snicket showed when evaluating fresh meat for the testing programs. They were resources to be exploited, entertainment to be consumed, competition to be eliminated. When had that happened? When had I stopped seeing other humans as people and started seeing them as variables in the equation of survival? The parade continued for hours. War Boss Scarjaw himself made an appearance, riding in a throne made from the fused wreckage of Imperial vehicles and decorated with the skulls of space marines. He was a monster, even by orc standards, with a 12-foot scarred mass of muscle and crude cybernetics, with tusks like ivory daggers and eyes that held the cold intelligence of a born predator. As his vehicle passed our section of the line, his gaze swept over the assembled slaves. When his eyes met mine, I felt something like electricity run down my spine. For just a moment, I saw myself through his eyes, not as a person, but as a thing. A useful thing, perhaps, but ultimately disposable. And the most terrifying part was that it felt natural, appropriate. I was a thing now, and things existed to serve their owners. The recognition brought not horror, but a kind of relief. It was so much easier to be property than to maintain the exhausting pretense of personhood. The loot distribution began immediately after the parade ended. The returning orcs claimed first pick of the spoils, followed by the mechs and other specialists. What remained was divided among the camp's permanent residents, according to their status in the hierarchy. We slaves, of course, got nothing, but we were allowed to sort through the belongings of the new prisoners, cataloging and organizing them for distribution. This was presented as routine work, but I quickly realized it was another form of psychological warfare. Handling the personal effects of people who had been free just days before was an exercise in vicarious trauma. I found myself going through a child's backpack, noting the careful way his school supplies had been organized, the small toy vehicle he'd carried for comfort. Somewhere in the galaxy, that child was now dead or enslaved, and his treasured possessions were being evaluated for their utility to creatures who viewed him as livestock. But worse than the children's items were the adult belongings. The love letters between spouses, the family photographs with faces carefully cut out by orc knives, the prayer books and personal icons that had failed to protect their owners when the waagh came calling. "Gets easier," observed 12, working beside me at one of the sorting tables. "After a while you stop seeing the stories. Just see the materials." "How long did it take you?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment, carefully folding a wedding dress that would probably become cleaning rags for the mech boys. "About 3 months. The day I stopped wondering about the people who owned these things was the day I knew I was going to survive this place. 3 months. I'd been here 6 weeks, and I could already feel that transformation beginning. The items in my hands were becoming abstract: leather for repairs, metal for scrap, fabric for bandages. The human stories they represented were fading like old photographs, becoming less real with each passing day. That night, they celebrated to honor the returning warriors. The sounds of orc revelry echoed across the camp: crude music, violent laughter, and the occasional scream from whatever entertainment they'd arranged for themselves. We weren't invited to watch, but we could hear everything from our pen. "They're using the cathedral bell as a percussion instrument," noted 63 with academic interest. "Listen, you can hear the harmonics. It was perfectly tuned for the litany of devotion, but the orcs are using it to keep time for their war songs." She was right. The sacred bronze that had once called the faithful to prayer was now providing rhythm for celebrations of conquest and slaughter. It was a perfect metaphor for what the waagh did to everything it touched, not destroyed, but corrupted, perverted, made to serve purposes antithetical to its original meaning. As I lay in the darkness listening to the desecrated bell, I tried to remember the last time I had attended a proper imperial service. The incense, the solemn hymns, the sense of being part of something larger and more meaningful than myself. But the memories felt thin, insubstantial, like stories I'd heard about someone else's life. The bell rang on through the night, marking time for alien celebrations, while I wondered if there was anything left of Guardsman Lysander Croak worth saving. And if there was, whether I even wanted to save it. But my education, in the brutal hierarchy of the waagh, was entering a new phase. Soon I would encounter an unlikely teacher, a creature even lower in the pecking order than myself, but possessed of a cunning that might be the key to survival in this green hell. His name was Griselda, and he was the most dangerous creature I'd met in the entire camp. Not because he was strong. Grots rarely exceeded 4 feet in height and possessed all the physical intimidation of a malnourished child. But Griselda had something far more valuable than strength. He had intelligence and the cunning to hide it behind a facade of typical grot stupidity. I first noticed him during my 7th week, when I was assigned to inventory duty in the smaller workshops. While the other grots spent their time tormenting prisoners and competing for their overseer's attention, Griselda worked quietly in the background, observing everything and everyone with those sharp, predatory eyes that marked him as fundamentally different from his brethren. He approached me during a meal break, sidling up with the casual air of someone making idle conversation. "You're the one who looked in the mirror, squig, ain't you?" he said without preamble. Snot Guzzler told everyone about it, said you went all pale and wobbly after. I tensed, waiting for the inevitable mockery or threats that seemed to follow any sign of weakness in the camp. But Griselda just nodded approvingly. Good, he continued. Means you're smart enough to see what you are becoming. Most Yumis, they never realize. Just stumble about until something eats them. What do you want? I asked, keeping my voice low. Conversations with grots were always dangerous. They were notorious for twisting your words and using them against you later. Want? I don't want nothing. But I might be willing to share some wisdom, like professional courtesy, you might say. Professional courtesy. His grin revealed teeth that had been filed to points, a modification I hadn't seen on other grots. We're both survivors, ain't we? Both learned to play the game. The difference is, I've been playing it longer. Over the following days, Griselda began to teach me the real rules that governed life in the camp. Not the obvious ones about showing respect to your betters and avoiding the dangerous squigs, but the subtle dynamics that determined who lived and who died in the constant struggle for resources and position. See, most people think the orcs are just stupid brutes, he explained during one of our careful conversations. And that's mostly true. But they're not random, stupid. They have their own logic, their own way of looking at things. You learn to think like them. You can predict what they want before they know it themselves. The first lesson was about usefulness. Everyone in the camp understood that being useful was essential to survival, but most interpreted that to mean being good at their assigned tasks. Griselda taught me that true usefulness was about making yourself indispensable in ways that weren't immediately obvious. Take old Sludge Gut, he said, referring to the mech boy who ran Workshop 17. Everyone thinks he keeps his favorite workers around because they're good at welding or rivet hammering, but that's not it at all. He keeps them because they remember things, where he put his tools, which projects was he working on yesterday, how many teeth did he loan to other mechs. Memory, it turned out, was a precious commodity among the orcs. Their minds worked differently from human ones, focused entirely on the present moment, with little capacity for detailed recall. A human who could remember past conversations, track ongoing projects, and anticipate future needs was worth more than a dozen strong backs. But you can't be too obvious about it, Griselda warned. Start acting like you are smarter than them, and they'll stomp you just on principle. Gotta make them think the good ideas are coming from them. The second lesson was about the economy of favors that operated beneath the surface of camp life. Every service rendered, every small kindness, every piece of information shared created debts and obligations that could be called upon later. But it was a delicate system, requiring careful calculation of when to help and when to withhold assistance. Helped too many people early on, Griselda admitted. Thought being generous would make me popular. Instead, it just made me a target. Orcs don't respect generosity. They see it as weakness. But calculated self-interest, that they understand. He showed me how to read the subtle signs that indicated which orcs were rising in the hierarchy and which were falling from favor. A mech boy whose projects were being assigned more resources. A runthard whose slaves were being given better rations. A knob whose opinions were being sought more frequently by his superiors. Attach yourself to the rising stars, but not too closely, he advised, and always have an exit strategy when they start to fall. The third lesson was the most important and the most disturbing. It was about the transformation that all long-term survivors underwent, the gradual erosion of whatever they had been before, replaced by something that could thrive in the green hell of the waagh. You think you're still human, Griselda observed during one of our conversations. Still think like a Yumi, still got Yumi feelings and Yumi morals. But that's changing, isn't it? A little bit every day. He was right, and I hated him for saying it. Every day brought small compromises, tiny betrayals of everything I had once believed about right and wrong. I had learned to hoard food while others starved. I had learned to step over the weak rather than help them up. I had learned to find entertainment in the suffering of new prisoners, because their pain reminded me that I was no longer new, no longer vulnerable in quite the same way. Our secret, he continued, is to embrace it. Stop fighting what you are becoming and start using it. That guilt you feel, that's just dead weight. Cut it loose and see how much easier everything gets. But Griselda's most valuable lesson wasn't philosophical. It was practical. He taught me about the network of information that flowed through the camp like an underground river, and how to tap into it without drawing unwanted attention. The grots, it turned out, were the camp's nervous system. They scuttled between workshops and barracks, carrying messages and gossip, observing everything and everyone. Most of them were too stupid or too focused on their immediate concerns to make use of what they learned. But a few, like Griselda, had learned to collect and trade information like a currency. Knowledge is power, he explained, but only if you know how to use it. Tell the wrong person the right information, and you're dead. Tell the right person the wrong information, and you're also dead. But tell the right person the right information at the right time. That makes you valuable. He showed me how to identify the key players in the camp's political structure, and how to predict their needs and desires, which mech boys were competing for resources, which knobs were plotting against each other, for which projects were likely to succeed and which were doomed to failure. Information wants to flow, he said. Your job is to be the channel it flows through, not to dam what tries to stop it. Over the weeks that followed, I began to put Griselda's lessons into practice. I started paying closer attention to the conversations around me, memorizing names and relationships, tracking the subtle shifts in the camp's power structure. I learned to anticipate Sludgegut's needs, appearing with the right tool or material just as he was looking for it. I began to position myself as indispensable not through strength or skill, but through careful observation and strategic helpfulness. The results were immediate and dramatic. My rations improved. My work assignments became less dangerous. The casual violence that was a constant threat to most slaves began to pass me by. I was becoming valuable, and valuable things were protected. But there was a price for this protection, and it wasn't just the erosion of my moral compass. It was the growing realization that I was enjoying the game, the careful manipulation of personalities and circumstances, the strategic deployment of information, the gradual accumulation of influence. It was intoxicating in a way that my old life as a simple guardsman had never been. You're learning fast, Griselda observed with approval. Faster than most. Got a real talent for it, you do. A talent for what? Being like us, he said, and his grin was genuinely fond. Welcome to the Club 47. You've officially stopped being prey. That night, as I lay in our pen, listening to the distant sounds of orc celebrations, I tried to assess what I had become. The face I'd seen in the mirror squig was looking back at me from every reflective surface now, calculating, predatory, empty of everything that had once made me human. But for the first time since my capture, I wasn't afraid. Fear was for prey animals, and I was no longer prey. I was a predator now, just like Griselda, just like all the other survivors who had learned to play the game and play it well. The realization should have horrified me. Instead, it felt like coming home. But survival in the waagh demanded more than just political cunning and information trading. Soon, I would be introduced to an aspect of orc civilization that would test not just my ability to endure physical horror, but my willingness to participate in it. They called him Doc Scarjaw, and he was an artist in the medium of suffering. Where other orcs were content with simple brutality, the painboy approached agony with the dedication of a master craftsman perfecting his technique. His workshop occupied an entire building in the medical district, a maze of operating theaters, holding cells, and experimentation chambers where the screams never quite stopped echoing. I was assigned to his service during my 10th week, supposedly as punishment for a minor infraction involving the delayed delivery of ammunition to Workshop 17. But Griselda had warned me that Doc Scarjaw specifically requested workers with interesting reactions to pain, and I suspected my mirror squig experience had marked me as a candidate for his special attention. The painboy himself was a testament to his own surgical skills. Half his body had been replaced with mechanical augmentations of his own design, not crude orc prosthetics, but elegant devices that moved with fluid precision. His left arm terminated in a cluster of surgical implements that could extend and retract at will, while his right eye had been replaced with a magnifying lens array that allowed him to see details invisible to normal vision. "Ah, 47, he said when I was brought to his primary operating theater. "I've been hearing interesting things about you." Very interesting indeed. His voice was different from other orcs, quieter, more precise, with an almost human quality that made it somehow more disturbing than their usual bellowing. When he spoke, his various mechanical components whirred and clicked in harmony, creating a subtle musical accompaniment to his words. "You're going to be my special assistant," he continued, gesturing toward a table covered with instruments I couldn't identify. "Gonna help me with my research into Umi pain responses. Very scientific, very educational." The first operation I witnessed was on a grot volunteer, one of dozens who presented themselves daily for Doc Scarjaw's experimentation. The procedure involved grafting mechanical components directly into the creature's nervous system, supposedly to enhance its reflexes and combat effectiveness. "The theory is sound," the painboy explained as he worked, his surgical implements moving with disturbing grace. "Connect the brain directly to the weapon systems. Eliminate the delay caused by conscious thought. Should make for much better fighters." The grot was conscious throughout the procedure. Anesthetics were considered wasteful when dealing with test subjects. I watched in fascination as Doc Scarjaw opened the creature's skull with surgical precision, exposing the grey-green brain tissue beneath. Cables were inserted with delicate care, their other ends connecting to a crude targeting system mounted on the grot's shoulder. "Hold this," the painboy commanded, handing me a retractor that kept the incision open. "And pay attention. You're gonna be doing this yourself soon enough." The process took hours of watching as foreign technology was integrated into living tissue, as neural pathways were rerouted and rewired according to principles I couldn't begin to understand. The grot's screams gradually faded to whimpers, then to a strange humming sound that seemed to come from the mechanical components themselves. When it was finished, the result was horrific and beautiful in equal measure. The volunteer could aim and fire weapons with supernatural accuracy, its enhanced reflexes allowing it to track and engage targets faster than any normal creature. But there was nothing left in its eyes that resembled consciousness, just the cold calculation of a living weapon. "Magnificent," Doc Scarjaw declared, making notes on a slate covered with anatomical diagrams. "Much better results than the last batch. I think the secret is using fresh subjects, ones that still have strong neural activity." Fresh subjects. The implication was clear, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Over the following days, I learned the full scope of Dr. Scarjaw's research. He was attempting to create the perfect fusion of organic and mechanical components, using living subjects as testbeds for increasingly complex procedures. Some experiments focused on enhancing existing capabilities, strength, speed, sensory acuity. Others were more ambitious, attempting to graft entirely alien organs or mechanical systems into unwilling hosts. The success rate was appallingly low, but Doc Scarjaw seemed more interested in the failures than the successes. Each botched procedure taught him something new about the limits of biological adaptation, information he carefully recorded for future reference. "Failure is just success, what ain't happened yet," he explained, as we disposed of the remains of a particularly ambitious attempt to graft attack squig organs into a human subject. "Every mistake teaches me something new about how far I can push the boundaries." My role in these experiments grew more active as the weeks passed. At first, I was just an observer, holding instruments and taking notes, but gradually, Doc Scarjaw began involving me in the actual procedures, applying sutures, monitoring vital signs, making incisions under his careful supervision. "You got good hands," he observed approvingly as I completed my first solo nerve graft. "Steady, precise, and you don't get squeamish when they start screaming. That's important in this line of work." He was right about the screaming. At some point during my time in his service, I had stopped hearing it as expressions of pain and started hearing it as data, indicators of stress tolerance, neural response patterns, and psychological breaking points. The subjects weren't people anymore. They were experimental parameters to be measured and recorded. The transformation was so gradual, I barely noticed it happening. One day, I was holding down a struggling human volunteer, while Doc Scarjaw prepared to graft mechanical enhancements into his spine. The next day, I was the one making the initial incisions, my hands moving with the same clinical precision I'd observed in my instructor. "Beautiful work," Doc Scarjaw commented as I completed a particularly complex procedure involving the integration of a targeting computer into a subject's visual cortex. "You've got real talent for this. Maybe you should consider making it permanent." "Permanent?" I asked. "Sure. I could use a proper assistant, someone who understands the work. I will fix you up with some nice augmentations, better hands for surgical work, enhanced vision for detail work, and maybe some neural improvements to help you think more clearly. What do you say?" The offer was tempting in a way that terrified me. The mechanical augmentations I'd seen were crude by imperial standards, but they were undeniably effective. Enhanced strength, improved senses, direct neural interface with tools and weapons. It would make me more capable, more valuable, more likely to survive. But it would also make me something that was no longer human in any meaningful sense. "I'll consider it," I said carefully. "Course you will. Smart Umi like you, bound to see the advantages. Take your time, think it over. But don't take too long. Good opportunities don't wait around forever." That night, back in our pen, I found myself studying my hands in the dim light filtering through the camp's ever-present smoke. They were stained with blood and other fluids I preferred not to identify, and they moved with a surgeon's precision when I flexed the fingers. When had that happened? When had I developed the manual dexterity necessary to perform complex medical procedures on unwilling subjects? More importantly, when had I stopped caring about the unwilling part? "You're changing again," observed Griselda, who had managed to position himself near me during the evening meal distribution. "Can see it in your eyes. Getting that look what all Doc Scarjaw's assistants get after a while." "What look?" "Like you are seeing through people instead of at them. Like you're already picking out which bits would be most interesting to cut open." He was right, and the realization was both horrifying and liberating. I was looking at my fellow prisoners differently now, not as people to sympathize with, but as potential subjects for experimentation. The weak ones, who were unlikely to survive much longer anyway. The unstable ones whose psychological breaking points would provide interesting data. The physically unusual ones might offer unique research opportunities. It was a way of thinking that would have appalled Guardsman Lysander Croak. But Guardsman Lysander Croak was dead. Had been dead for months. I was something else now. Something that could appreciate the elegant brutality of Doc Scarjaw's work. Something that could find satisfaction in the precise application of surgical instruments to living tissue. The most disturbing part wasn't that I was becoming a monster. It was that I was becoming a monster by choice, and that choice felt increasingly natural with each passing day. But my transformation was accelerating, and soon I would face a test of just how far I was willing to go for the service of survival. The line between observer and participant was about to disappear entirely, and with it, any pretense that I was still the man who had once served the Emperor with faith and honor. The promotion came during my 12th week, a transfer from general labor to administrative duties. My new supervisor, Scarfang Jr., was smart enough to recognize that a human with administrative skills was more valuable as a collaborator than a victim. "Your job is simple," he said, showing me to my workspace. "Count things, record things, keep track of things, and make sure I look good." The work was tedious but safe, inventorying weapons, tracking slave deployment, and maintaining equipment records. But the real value was access. Administrative staff saw everything: supply manifests, personnel transfers, and strategic documents. For someone who'd learned to trade in information, it was like being given treasure vault keys. Within days, I'd compiled a comprehensive understanding of the camp's operations. I knew which workshops exceeded quotas, which mech boys competed for resources, and where weaknesses lay in defenses. But more importantly, I'd learned to use information strategically. Interesting observation about Workshop 15's ammunition consumption, I mentioned casually to Scarfang Jr. They're using more materials than their output suggests. Either efficiency declined, or someone's skimming supplies. I provided just enough detail to point suspicion toward a rival mech boy. Within a week, there was a reorganization that eliminated troublesome individuals and elevated someone favorable to our faction. "You've got real talent for noticing patterns," Scarfang Jr. commented approvingly. The praise felt good, better than it should have. I was becoming skilled at manipulation, at using information as a weapon. The man I used to be would have been disgusted, but that man was dead. My growing reputation brought new responsibilities. I painted identification glyphs on equipment, updated slave rosters, and, most significantly, prisoner evaluation. Assessing new captives for usefulness required careful observation of human psychology. "This one's got leadership experience," I noted, reviewing new arrivals. "Military bearing, strategic thinking, but too much pride, liable to organize resistance." "Recommendation?" Scarfang Jr. asked. "Painboy duty. Break the pride without damaging the strategic mind." The man was led away, believing his rank made him valuable enough to negotiate. Within a week, he was back, broken, compliant, ready to inform on fellow prisoners for minor privileges. I felt nothing watching his transformation. He was simply a resource processed and optimized for a purpose. But the true test came when they brought in Captain Eleanor Voss, my former commander from Tertius Prime. "Croak," she whispered, using my real name. "Lysander Croak. Thank the Emperor, I thought you were dead." For a moment, something stirred a ghost of loyalty and respect, but it was overwhelmed by cold calculation. Captain Voss was a resource to be evaluated. "Designation is 47 now," I replied professionally. "Name and rank for records." Hope died in her eyes as she realized what I'd become. "Standard labor assignment," I recommended. "No leadership potential, average capability, likely to survive 3 to 4 months." It was a lie. She was intelligent, experienced and charismatic. But some buried part of me influenced the recommendation. Over the following weeks, I watched the proud officer transform into a broken prisoner, designated 93, documenting her psychological deterioration for future prisoner management. I felt proud of the work. It had been a subtle, precise, effective, and perfect application of psychological pressure. The fact that she'd once been someone I respected was irrelevant to the outcome's quality. The signs had been building for weeks, but I had been too focused on my administrative duties to recognize their significance. Increased ammunition production, expanded vehicle maintenance schedules, requisitions for field rations and medical supplies on a scale that dwarfed anything I'd seen before. It wasn't until War Boss Scarjaw called for a general assembly that the pieces fell into place. The Waagh was going to war. Real war. Not the casual raiding and planetary bombardment that had become routine, but a full-scale military campaign against a target worthy of the entire force's attention. The excitement was palpable throughout the camp, orcs bellowing with anticipation, grots scurrying about with renewed purpose, even the normally docile slaves showing signs of nervous energy. "This is it, boys," Scarjaw roared from his improvised podium, a throne made from fused Imperial vehicles and decorated with the skulls of his defeated enemies. "This is the big one we've been building toward. Time to show the galaxy what a proper waagh can do." The target was a forge world called Metallicus Prime, one of the Adeptus Mechanicus's primary manufacturing centers, protected by extensive orbital defenses and garrisoned by 3 regiments of Skitarii. It would be the largest military operation the waagh had undertaken since its inception, requiring months of preparation and the coordination of resources from across multiple star systems. And I was going to be part of it. "You're coming with us," Scarfang Jr. announced with obvious pride. "Administrative support for the forward command post. Keep track of supplies, manage prisoner assignments, and make sure everything runs smoothly. Big responsibility for a Yumi, but you've earned it." The implications were staggering. I was being integrated into the Orcs' military command structure, trusted with responsibilities that would directly support their campaign of conquest and destruction. The man I used to be would have been horrified by the prospect, serving the very creatures who had enslaved me, helping them wage war against the Imperium I had sworn to defend. But the creature I had become felt only excitement and anticipation. This was an opportunity to prove my value, to demonstrate the skills I had developed, to secure my position in the hierarchy through competent service to my masters. The fact that success would mean the deaths of thousands of Imperial citizens was irrelevant to my personal advancement. The preparation began immediately. Massive war machines that had been dormant for months roared to life, belching smoke and flame as their engines were tested and calibrated. Workshops that had been producing equipment for camp maintenance switched to military hardware, ammunition, spare parts, and field equipment for extended campaigns. The slave population was mobilized on an unprecedented scale. Some were assigned to vehicle maintenance, crawling through the guts of mechanical monsters to perform repairs and modifications. Others were tasked with loading supplies, hauling tons of ammunition and equipment to staging areas throughout the camp. A lucky few, including myself, were selected for direct support roles with the command structure, but the majority were designated as expendable assets, cannon fodder to be expended as circumstances required. "Combat slaves," explained Doc Scarjaw as he reviewed the personnel assignments. "Suicide bombers, human shields, living ammunition for the bigger guns. Not expected to survive, but that's not really the point. The point is to absorb enemy fire and create confusion." The processing of combat slaves was horrific, even by the camp's standards. They were fitted with crude, explosive devices that could be triggered remotely chained to weapon platforms to prevent retreat, and subjected to psychological conditioning designed to make them more effective in their final moments. Many didn't survive the preparation process, but there were always more prisoners to replace them. I watched the entire operation with professional interest, taking notes on efficiency improvements and resource allocation. The mass conversion of human beings into living weapons was fascinating from an operational standpoint, a perfect example of how the orcs approached complex logistical challenges with characteristic brutality and ingenuity. "Excellent documentation," Scarfang Jr. commented as he reviewed my reports. "Very thorough, very professional. You've really found your calling in this line of work." My calling. The phrase stuck with me as I watched thousands of my fellow humans being processed into instruments of destruction. Was this what I was meant for? Had all my experiences in the camp been leading to this moment, when I would help facilitate the murder of my own species for the entertainment of alien conquerors? The answer, I realized, was yes. This was exactly what I was meant for, because this was what I had chosen to become. Every compromise, every collaboration, every small betrayal of my former principles had been a step toward this moment. I had transformed myself into something that could not only survive in the green hell of the waagh, but thrive in it. The vehicle assignments were announced during my 14th week. I would be traveling aboard the command battle wagon, a mobile fortress the size of a building, equipped with communications equipment, planning facilities, and enough firepower to level a city block. My quarters were a small compartment near the command center, furnished with the basic equipment necessary for my administrative duties. It was luxury beyond anything I had experienced since my capture. A private space, regular meals, and protection from the casual violence that plagued the general population. I had earned it through competence, collaboration, and the systematic abandonment of everything that had once made me human. "You've come a long way from the scared little Yumi what got dragged in here 4 months ago," observed Griselda during one of our final conversations before departure. "Proud of what you have become, I am. Real success story. 4 months. It seemed impossible that so little time had passed since my capture. The man who had been branded as 47 felt like a different person entirely, weak, naive, clinging to principles and beliefs that had no survival value in the reality of the waagh. I was better now, stronger, more capable, more useful. The final preparations took place over a period of days as the full scale of the mobilization became clear. This wasn't just a military campaign, it was a migration. Entire workshops were being packed up and transported. Families of grots were loading their possessions onto supply wagons. Even the squig pits were being relocated, their inhabitants transferred to mobile containment systems. The war was transforming itself from a static occupation force into a mobile army of conquest, and I was part of that transformation. Not as a prisoner or slave, but as a valued member of the support staff. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had achieved a kind of freedom through absolute collaboration with my captors. But there was one final test before departure. "Need you to handle something special," Scarfang Jr. said, handing me a data slate covered with personnel records. "Got a problem with some of the combat slaves. Morale issues. Need someone who understands Yumi psychology to sort it out." The problem was in Block 7, where a group of newer prisoners had been designated for suicide bomber duty. Instead of accepting their assignment with resignation, they were actively resisting, refusing to cooperate with the fitting of explosive devices, attempting to organize some kind of escape plan, even talking about sabotage. Their leader was Captain Elena Voss. I found her in the center of a small group of prisoners, speaking in quiet but urgent tones about duty and honor, and the importance of dying as humans rather than as weapons. The sight should have stirred some emotion in me, admiration for her courage, guilt over my role in her capture and conditioning, something that connected me to the person I used to be. Instead, I felt only irritation at her inefficiency. She was disrupting the smooth operation of the military preparation, creating problems that would require time and resources to resolve. Her behavior was not only futile, but counterproductive to the goals of the organization I now served. 93, I said, using her slave designation with casual authority. Report to my office for reassignment evaluation. She looked at me with eyes that still held traces of the officer she had once been. I know who you really are, Croak. I know what you've become, but I also know there's still something human left in there, buried under all the collaboration and compromise. Designation is 47, I corrected, and you will address me as administrator. Now report for evaluation, or I will recommend you for immediate processing by Dr. Scarjaw. The threat was real and she knew it, but instead of complying, she straightened to attention and spoke with the voice of command I remembered from our days serving together. Guardsman Lysander Croak, I am issuing you a direct order. Remember your oath to the Emperor. Remember your duty to humanity. Remember who you swore to be. For just a moment I felt something crack inside me. A fragment of memory surfaced, kneeling in a chapel on Tertius Prime, swearing sacred oaths to protect the innocent and serve the Emperor's will. The man who had made those oaths felt real for a handful of heartbeats, solid and present and horrified by what his future self had become. Then the moment passed, and I was myself again. Professional, efficient, loyal to the organization that had given me purpose and meaning. Guards, I called, summoning the Ork overseers who supervised the combat slave preparation. 93 is disrupting operations and spreading seditious ideology among assigned personnel. Recommend immediate termination as an example to others. Captain Elena Voss was executed that evening, along with the other ringleaders of the resistance movement. The remaining combat slaves accepted their assignments without further protest, understanding that rebellion led only to death without purpose. I watched the executions from the command center, taking notes on their effectiveness as psychological deterrents. It was educational and professionally satisfying, a problem identified and resolved through the appropriate application of force. That night, as the great war machines began their journey toward the battlefield, I realized I had finally achieved what I had been working toward since my capture. I was no longer a prisoner or a slave. I was a valued member of the organization, trusted with important responsibilities and protected by my usefulness. I was free in the only way that mattered, in the green hell of the waagh. Sound of massive engines starting up, metal tracks grinding against stone, war horns blowing in the distance. But freedom came with its own burdens, and soon I would discover that serving the waagh demanded more than just administrative competence. The battlefield would test not just my loyalty to my new masters, but my willingness to participate directly in the destruction of everything I had once sworn to protect. The battlefield was a symphony of destruction that stretched beyond the horizon, a cacophony of violence so overwhelming it seemed to warp reality itself. Metallicus Prime had not fallen easily. Its Skitarii defenders and orbital defense platforms had extracted a terrible price from the attacking waagh, turning the assault into a grinding war of attrition that had already lasted 3 weeks. From my position in the command battle wagon, I had a perfect view of the carnage. Massive orc war machines traded fire with Imperial Titans across a landscape that had been bombed into abstract art. Waves of green-skinned infantry charged across fields of razor wire and tank traps. their war cries audible even over the constant thunder of artillery. And everywhere, scattered among the organized chaos, were the human slaves who served as the Waagh's expendable assets. "Supply run," bellowed Nob Scarjaw, the massive orc who commanded our sector of the line. "Need more Daka for the big guns. You, 47, grab some Yumis and get that ammunition up to the front." The assignment was routine by now, something I'd done dozens of times since the siege began. Load ammunition onto crude sleds, chain human slaves to the hauling harnesses, and drive them forward across the killing fields while enemy snipers try to pick us off. Simple work, requiring only basic logistics and a willingness to treat human beings as beasts of burden. I selected 6 slaves from the pool of available labor, all men, all relatively strong, all showing the proper degree of broken submission that made them reliable for dangerous work. Among them was a former PDF trooper, designated 68, whose technical knowledge had made him useful for equipment maintenance. "Standard ammunition run to grid 77, I informed them, as we loaded the sleds with shells the size of wine barrels. "Keep low, move fast, don't think about anything except putting one foot in front of the other." Questions? There were no questions. There never were any more. The slaves who survived long enough to be trusted with frontline duties had learned that curiosity and initiative were liabilities. They followed orders, completed assigned tasks, and tried not to attract attention from anyone higher in the hierarchy. The journey to the gun positions took us across 2 kilometers of contested ground, through a maze of trenches and shell craters that had been carved into the planet's surface by weeks of constant bombardment. Overhead, orc fighter bombers dueled with Imperial interceptors in aerial combat that rained debris and burning fuel onto the battlefield below. "Keep moving," I shouted as 68 stumbled under the weight of his harness, nearly causing the entire team to lose momentum. "The gun crews need these shells more than you need rest." It was true. The big guns, massive artillery pieces that could level city blocks with single shots, were the key to the orc advance. As long as they kept firing, the Imperial defenders were pinned in their bunkers and unable to mount effective counterattacks. But they consumed ammunition at a prodigious rate, requiring constant resupply runs by teams exactly like ours. We made it to grid 77 without casualties, though 2 of the slaves collapsed from exhaustion during the final approach. The gun crews unloaded the ammunition with practiced efficiency, already calling for the next delivery before the last shell had been removed from the sleds. "Good work, 47, grunted the mech in charge of the battery, a scarred veteran whose mechanical arm had been modified to interface directly with his weapons targeting systems. "That's the kind of service we need. Regular, reliable, no nonsense." The praise felt good, better than it should have. I was developing a professional pride in my work, taking satisfaction in the smooth operation of supply lines that kept the Waagh's war machine functioning. The fact that those same supply lines were enabling the destruction of an Imperial world was irrelevant to the quality of my performance. The return journey was more dangerous, as Imperial artillery had bracketed our route during our approach. We had to zigzag between impact craters and burning vehicle wrecks, constantly alert for the whistle of incoming shells that gave only seconds of warning before detonation. That's when we encountered the survivors. They were hiding in a collapsed bunker about halfway back to our lines, a squad of Skitarii who had been cut off during the morning's fighting. Their augmetic enhancements sparked with damage, and several were badly wounded, but they still had fight left in them. When they saw our supply convoy, they opened fire with what weapons they had remaining. The first burst cut down 2 of the slaves instantly, their bodies jerking like marionettes as lass bolts punched through flesh and bone. The survivors threw themselves to the ground, seeking cover behind the ammunition sleds, while I calculated our options. The logical choice was retreat. We were lightly armed and outnumbered, carrying valuable cargo that couldn't be risked in unnecessary combat. Standard procedure called for withdrawing to a safe distance and calling for orc infantry to deal with the survivors. But there was another option, one that appealed to the part of me that had learned to find satisfaction in solving complex problems. 68, I called to the former PDF trooper. How much technical knowledge do you retain about Imperial equipment? Enough, he replied carefully, recognizing that the wrong answer could be fatal. The Skitarii have damaged augmetics. If their targeting systems are compromised, their accuracy will degrade over time. We can exploit that. I outlined a simple but effective plan. Using the ammunition sleds as mobile cover, we would advance in stages, forcing the Skitarii to exhaust their limited power cells while staying beyond their effective range. Once their weapons were depleted, we could close the distance and finish them with hand weapons. It was a tactic that treated human lives, both my own team and the enemy survivors, as expendable resources in service of a larger objective. The old me would have been horrified by the casual calculation involved. The new me found it intellectually satisfying. The plan worked perfectly. 20 minutes later, the last of the Skitarii lay dead among the ruins of their defensive position, their advanced technology rendered useless by superior tactics and ruthless execution. I had personally killed 3 of them, using a captured lass rifle with the same clinical efficiency I'd once applied to administrative tasks. Very nice work, commented Nob Scarjaw when I reported the encounter. Shows proper initiative, proper thinking. Maybe you're ready for bigger responsibilities. Bigger responsibilities. The phrase carried implications that should have terrified me, but instead, I felt anticipation. Each new assignment was an opportunity to prove my value, to demonstrate the skills I'd developed, to advance my position within the hierarchy of the waagh. Over the following days, those bigger responsibilities materialized. I was assigned to coordinate multiple supply runs simultaneously, managing teams of slaves across different sectors of the battlefield. The work required careful planning and real-time adaptation as tactical situations changed, skills that translated well from my previous administrative experience. But it also required a willingness to make decisions about who lived and who died. Grid 4-2 is taking heavy fire, reported one of my runner slaves during a particularly intense bombardment. Team 7 requests permission to delay delivery until the barrage lifts. I consulted the tactical displays, noting the ammunition consumption rates at various gun positions. Grid 4-2's artillery was critical to suppressing an Imperial counterattack that threatened to overrun our forward positions. The shells had to be delivered on schedule, regardless of casualties. Negative, I replied. Team 7 will proceed as ordered. If they take losses, substitute personnel from the reserve pool. Team 7 suffered 60% casualties during that run, but the ammunition reached its destination on time. The Imperial counterattack was broken up by concentrated artillery fire, preserving orc positions that would have otherwise been lost. From an operational standpoint, it was a complete success. The fact that 4 human beings had died to achieve that success was simply the cost of doing business in the meat grinder of the waagh. Their sacrifice had served a purpose, contributing to the larger objective in a way that their lives as prisoners never could have. Excellent judgment, Scarfang Jr. observed when he reviewed my reports. Proper priorities, proper understanding of resource allocation. You're thinking like a real orc now. Thinking like a real orc. The comment should have been an insult, a reminder of how far I'd fallen from my original humanity. Instead, it felt like recognition of achievement, acknowledgement, that I had successfully adapted to the demands of my environment. But adaptation came with its own costs, and those costs became clear during my final week on Metallicus Prime. The breakthrough came without warning, a coordinated assault by Orc forces that shattered the Imperial defensive lines and opened the way to the Forge World's primary manufacturing complexes. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughter, as millions of tons of military hardware descended on a population that had exhausted its defensive resources. I was assigned to prisoner processing duties, evaluating captured Imperial personnel for their potential value to the waagh. It was work I'd done before, but never on this scale. Thousands of civilians, soldiers, and tech priests streamed through the evaluation centers, their fates determined by my assessments and recommendations. Most were designated for immediate disposal. Too old, too young, too damaged by combat stress to be useful as slaves. Others were marked for specialized processing, the strong for labor details, the intelligent for administrative roles, the technically skilled for workshop assignments. A few would be selected for Dr. Scarjaw's experimental programs, contributing to Ork's knowledge of human physiology and psychology. It was efficient, systematic, and absolutely monstrous. I was processing human beings like livestock, sorting them according to their utility while discarding those who failed to meet minimum standards. The scale of suffering I was facilitating was beyond anything I could have imagined during my days as a simple guardsman, and I felt nothing. No guilt, no horror, no recognition of shared humanity. They were just resources to be allocated, problems to be solved, data points in a larger operational matrix. The fact that each decision I made determined whether someone lived or died was no more emotionally significant than choosing which supplies to prioritize for shipment. The most disturbing part wasn't that I had become capable of such acts. It was that I was good at them. My evaluations were accurate, my recommendations were sound, and my processing rates exceeded performance benchmarks by considerable margins. I had found my true calling in service to the waagh, and that calling was the systematic dehumanization of my own species. Outstanding performance, Doc Scarjaw commented as he reviewed my work. Really outstanding. You've got a real gift for this kind of work. Natural talent, combined with proper training and good attitude. That night, as I lay in my private quarters, listening to the sounds of celebration echoing across the conquered city, I tried to remember what it had felt like to be human. But the memories were thin and insubstantial, like stories I'd heard about someone else's life. The person who had sworn oaths to the Emperor, who had believed in duty and honor and the value of human life, was as dead as the millions of corpses littering the battlefield. In his place was something else, something that could thrive in the green hell of the waagh, something that could find purpose and meaning in service to alien conquerors, something that could process human suffering with the detached efficiency of a calculating machine. I was free, successful, and valued by my superiors. I had achieved everything I'd worked towards since my capture, earned my place through competence and collaboration. The cost of that achievement was everything I had once been. But that seemed a small price to pay for survival and advancement. But my journey through the green hell was far from over. Soon, I would face a choice that would force me to confront the ultimate implications of my transformation and decide whether the creature I had become was worth preserving, or whether some acts were too monstrous even for a monster to commit. The opportunity came during our third week on Metallicus Prime, after the initial conquest, but before the full-scale looting operation could begin. The mechs had established a massive munitions depot in what had once been the Forge World's primary cathedral, a bitter irony that wasn't lost on any of the human slaves forced to work there. I was supervising the inventory process when Griselda approached me with an expression I'd learned to recognize as dangerous. The little grot had positioned himself well during the campaign, earning recognition for his ability to coordinate slave labor and manage complex logistical operations. But success had made him ambitious, and ambition in the hierarchy of the waagh often led to spectacular failures. "Got something interesting to show you," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure we weren't being observed. "Something what might interest someone with your specialized knowledge." He led me to a section of the depot that had been cordoned off for special projects, experimental weapons, and equipment that Doc Scarjaw was developing for future campaigns. What I saw there made my blood run cold, even after everything I'd witnessed and participated in. They were building human bombs, not the crude suicide devices I'd seen strapped to combat slaves. These were sophisticated weapons that used living humans as guidance systems for high-yield explosives. The victims were kept alive but completely immobilized. Their nervous systems interfaced with targeting computers that would use their pattern recognition abilities to identify and attack specific targets. "Beautiful work, isn't it?" Griselda commented with genuine admiration. "Doc Scarjaw's really outdone himself this time. Each one can take out a whole city block, and they're smart enough to tell the difference between military and civilian targets." The implications were staggering. These weapons weren't just instruments of destruction. They were perversions of everything human, turning our capacity for intelligence and moral judgment into tools for our own annihilation. It was the ultimate expression of orc philosophy, taking what made us human and corrupting it into something that served their purposes. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. "Because I got an idea," he replied, his grin taking on a particularly predatory quality. "See, the mechs are planning to use these beauties on the next target, some shrine world what's been given to waagh, trouble. But what if something went wrong? What if the whole depot had an accident? Sabotage." He was suggesting we sabotage the munitions depot, destroying the weapons before they could be deployed. It was a plan that would require careful coordination, intimate knowledge of the facility's security systems, and a willingness to risk not just our own lives, but those of every slave in the complex. "What's your interest in this?" I pressed. "You've done well here. Why risk everything on a sabotage operation that's almost certain to fail?" "Because I'm tired of being a pet," he said, and for the first time since I'd known him, I heard genuine emotions in his voice. "Tired of collaborating. Tired of pretending that what we're doing here is anything other than helping monsters murder innocent people. Maybe it's time to remember what we used to be." What we used to be? The phrase hit me like a physical blow, dredging up memories I'd thought were safely buried. Guardsman Lysander Croak had sworn oaths to protect the innocent, to stand against the darkness, to sacrifice his own life rather than betray the trust placed in him. That man would have jumped at the chance to strike back against his captors, regardless of the personal cost. But Guardsman Lysander Croak was dead. I was 47 now, a valued administrator in the organizational structure of the waagh, with responsibilities and privileges that depended on my continued cooperation. Sabotage would mean throwing all of that away, not just risking my life, but deliberately destroying everything I'd worked to achieve. "Think about it," Griselda continued. "We could save thousands, maybe millions of lives. All those people on the shrine world who don't even know they're being marked for death. Don't that mean something to you?" It should have meant something. It should have meant everything. But as I looked at the human bombs being prepared for deployment, I felt only a kind of detached professional interest. They were weapons, nothing more. Sophisticated and effective tools for achieving military objectives. The fact that their deployment would result in massive civilian casualties was irrelevant to their technical merits. "I need time to consider the operational implications," I said finally. "This kind of action would have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate tactical situation." "Operational implications," Griselda repeated, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Listen to yourself, 47. When did you start talking like one of them?" When indeed? I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when I'd begun thinking in terms of operational efficiency rather than human cost. When I'd started evaluating moral choices through the lens of organizational benefit. But the transformation was complete now, and there was no going back to whatever I'd been before. Over the next few days, I found myself analyzing Griselda's proposal with the same methodical approach I applied to all complex problems. The technical aspects were challenging, but not impossible. The depot's security systems had vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone with administrative access. The coordination requirements were manageable, given my authority over slave labor assignments. The timing would need to be precise, but that was simply a matter of careful planning. But the cost-benefit analysis was overwhelmingly negative. Success would mean the deaths of everyone in the complex, including hundreds of human slaves who had managed to survive this long. It would mean the destruction of valuable military assets that the waagh could use for legitimate strategic purposes. Most importantly, it would mean the end of my own carefully constructed position within the hierarchy, throwing away months of patient work for the sake of abstract moral principles. "Well?" Griselda asked during one of our carefully orchestrated meetings. "You made your decision yet?" "Yes," I replied, "the operation is not feasible. The risks outweigh any potential benefits, and the resources required could be better allocated to other purposes." His face went through a series of expressions: disappointment, anger, and finally a kind of resigned sadness that was somehow worse than any emotional outburst would have been. "I see," he said quietly. "So that's what you've become. Completely and totally one of Dim." "I've become a survivor," I corrected. "Someone who understands that noble gestures don't change fundamental realities. The shrine world is going to be attacked, whether we sabotage this depot or not. All we would accomplish is ensuring that we don't survive to see it." "Maybe that would be better," he replied. "Maybe there are some things worse than dying." He walked away then, and I never spoke to him again. 2 days later, he was reassigned to a hazardous duty detail that had a mortality rate of nearly 100%. It was presented as a routine personnel transfer, but I knew it was a punishment for his seditious suggestions. Someone had been monitoring our conversations, probably through surveillance devices I hadn't detected. I could have intervened. My position gave me enough influence to have him transferred to safer duties, or at least to ensure he received proper equipment for the dangerous assignment. But intervention would have associated me with his subversive activities, potentially compromising my own standing within the organization. So I did nothing. I filed the appropriate paperwork, updated the personnel records, and watched as one of the few creatures in the camp who had shown me genuine friendship was led away to die for the crime of remembering what we used to be. Griselda lasted 3 days on the hazardous duty detail before a malfunctioning piece of equipment tore him apart. His death was recorded as an industrial accident, the kind of routine mishap that claimed dozens of lives every day in the chaotic environment of the waagh. I felt nothing when I received the casualty report. No grief, no guilt, no sense of loss for a relationship that had meant something to me during the darkest period of my captivity. He was just another resource that had been consumed in service of the larger organization, no different from ammunition expended in battle or equipment worn out through use. But that night, lying in my private quarters, while the sounds of orc celebrations echoed through the conquered city, I found myself thinking about the human bombs, not as weapons or strategic assets, but as people. Each one had been someone's child, someone's parent, someone's friend. Each one had hopes and dreams and fears that were now irrelevant to their function as guidance systems for instruments of mass destruction. The thought should have horrified me. Instead, it felt like an intellectual exercise, an abstract problem with no emotional weight. I could understand, on a theoretical level, why someone might find the situation morally objectionable. But that understanding was purely academic, like knowing the rules of a game I had no interest in playing. I was free of conscience now, liberated from the burden of moral judgment that had once made every decision a struggle between competing principles. It was enormously liberating, allowing me to focus on practical concerns without being distracted by ethical considerations. The human bombs would be deployed as planned. The shrine world would be attacked and conquered. Millions of people would die in the service of the Waagh's expansion, and I would continue to serve as a valued administrator, helping to coordinate the logistics that made such operations possible. It was a good life, all things considered. Comfortable, secure, and filled with meaningful work that challenged my abilities and rewarded competent performance. The fact that it was built on the systematic destruction of everything I had once held dear was simply the price of admission to this exclusive club of survivors. But even the most carefully constructed new identity couldn't completely suppress the echoes of what came before. Soon, I would face a situation that would force me to confront the ultimate implications of my choices and discover whether any trace of Lysander Croak still existed beneath the efficient surface of 47. The orders came down on a Tuesday morning, the same day of the week when I'd first been dragged into this green hell, though I was probably the only one who bothered keeping track of such meaningless details. The entire waagh was mobilizing again, this time for what War Boss Scarjaw called the final push, a campaign that would either establish orc dominance over the entire sector or consume the war machine in a glorious conflagration of violence. Our target was Holy Terror itself, not the throne world directly. Even Scarjaw wasn't quite that ambitious, but Terra's outer defensive sphere, the ring of fortress worlds and naval installations that protected the approaches to humanity's birth world. It was a target that would draw the attention of every Imperial force within 100 light years, a battle that would make everything we'd done so far seem like minor skirmishes. "This is it, boys!" Scarjaw bellowed from his mobile throne as the great convoy assembled. "This is the fight that'll be remembered until the end of time. Win or lose, we are going to make such a noise that the whole galaxy will hear us coming." The scale of the mobilization was beyond anything I'd witnessed before. Millions of orcs, billions of tons of equipment, and a slave population that had swollen to include survivors from dozens of conquered worlds. The convoy stretched beyond the horizon in both directions, a river of metal and violence that seemed to have no beginning or end. My position in this vast machine was secure and comfortable. I traveled in one of the command vehicles, a mobile headquarters equipped with communication systems, planning facilities, and all the amenities necessary for strategic coordination. My quarters were spacious by orc standards, furnished with actual furniture and equipped with private sanitation facilities. But more importantly, I was trusted, valued, respected within the hierarchy for my competence and reliability. The human slaves who served under my supervision looked at me with a mixture of fear and envy. Fear of my authority, envy of my position. They understood that I had achieved something almost unimaginable. I had not just survived captivity, but thrived within it. Remarkable success story, observed Doc Scarjaw during one of our regular coordination meetings. From broken prisoner to essential personnel in less than 6 months. Really quite inspiring from a psychological standpoint. Inspiring. The word should have filled me with horror. Inspiring who? Other prisoners who might follow my path of collaboration and moral compromise. Future slaves who would learn to see cooperation with their captors as the key to survival. But I felt only professional satisfaction. I had identified a problem. How to survive in an environment designed to destroy everything that made me human. And I had solved it through careful analysis and strategic adaptation. The solution had worked exactly as intended, transforming me from a liability into an asset. The journey to the staging area took 3 weeks, during which I had ample opportunity to observe the slave population and assess their psychological state. What I saw was deeply concerning from an operational standpoint. Many of the newer captives still retained enough hope and identity to be considered security risks, while even some of the longer-term survivors showed signs of dangerous independence. Morale issues, I reported during a staff meeting with the senior orcs. Significant portions of the slave population are not fully acclimated to their situation. Recommend accelerated processing protocols to ensure compliance during combat operations. The recommendation was accepted and implemented immediately. Over the following days, thousands of slaves were subjected to attitude adjustment procedures designed to break down their resistance and replace it with loyal submission. The methods were refined versions of techniques I'd experienced myself: isolation, physical stress, psychological pressure, and the systematic destruction of personal identity. I supervised much of this process personally, applying lessons learned from my own transformation to optimize the efficiency of others' breaking. It was skilled work that required careful attention to individual psychology and precise timing of interventions. Too little pressure, and the subject retained dangerous independence. Too much, and they became useless for anything but the most basic labor. Excellent results, commented the runtard in charge of the operation. Much better compliance rates than we usually see. You've really got a gift for this kind of work. The praise felt good. It validated my expertise, confirmed my value to the organization, and demonstrated that my unique insights into human psychology were being put to good use. The fact that I was helping to break the spirits of my own species was irrelevant to the quality of the outcome. But not everyone was pleased with my performance. "You've become everything they wanted you to become," said a voice from the shadows of my private quarters. I spun around, reaching for the shock prod I kept for disciplining unruly slaves, only to freeze when I saw who was speaking. It was Captain Elena Voss, designation 93, who should have been dead, executed weeks ago for inciting rebellion among the combat slaves. "How?" I started, but she cut me off with a gesture. "How am I alive? Because you recommended execution, but didn't follow up to ensure it was carried out. Because somewhere in whatever you've become, there's still a fragment of the man who used to serve under my command." She was right, though I hadn't consciously realized it at the time. The execution order had been buried in routine paperwork, filed with dozens of similar recommendations that might or might not be acted upon, depending on resource availability and strategic priorities. It was the kind of administrative oversight that happened regularly in the chaotic environment of the waagh. But it wasn't an oversight. Some part of me, some buried remnant of Lysander Croak, had deliberately obscured the order, given her a chance to slip through the cracks and disappear into the vast population of expendable labor. "What do you want?" I asked, though I was already fairly certain I knew the answer. "I want you to remember who you used to be," she said simply. "I want you to look around and see what you've become part of, what you're helping to accomplish. And then I want you to choose whether that's really who you want to be." "I've already made my choice," I replied. I chose survival. I chose adaptation. I chose to become something that could thrive in this environment, rather than something that would be consumed by it. You chose to become their pet monster, she corrected. You chose to turn your intelligence and skills against your own people. You chose to become exactly what they needed, a human who thinks like an orc. Her words hit harder than they should have, dredging up memories and emotions I'd thought were safely buried. For just a moment, I could see myself through her eyes, not as a successful survivor, but as something monstrous. A traitor who had sold his soul for comfort and security. Then the moment passed, and I was myself again. Rational, practical, focused on what mattered. Get out, I said quietly, before I decide that your continued existence is a threat to operational security. She studied my face for a long moment, and I saw something die in her eyes. Whatever hope she'd held that some part of her former subordinate still existed was finally extinguished. Goodbye, Lysander, she said, as she moved toward the exit. I'm sorry for what they've made you into. But more than that, I'm sorry that you chose to let them. She was gone before I could respond, vanishing back into the anonymous mass of slave laborers, where she could hide indefinitely if she was careful. I could have raised the alarm, initiated a search, and had her hunted down and disposed of properly. But I didn't. Instead, I sat in my comfortable chair and tried to understand why her words had affected me so strongly. I was successful, secure, valued by my superiors, and feared by my subordinates. I had achieved everything I'd worked towards since my capture, earned a place in the hierarchy through competence and collaboration. So why did I feel so empty? The answer came to me as I listened to the distant sounds of the convoy, engines roaring, slaves marching, orcs singing their endless war songs. I felt empty because I was empty. The process of survival had required me to hollow out everything that had made me human, replacing it with calculated efficiency and ruthless pragmatism. I was successful, but success had cost me everything I'd once been. I was secure, but security had been purchased with the systematic betrayal of everyone I'd once sworn to protect. I was valued, but only for my willingness to help facilitate the destruction of my own species. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to truly think about what I'd become, not the comfortable rationalizations I'd constructed to justify my choices, but the brutal reality of what those choices had made me. I was a traitor, a collaborator, a monster who had learned to take pride in his own monstrosities. The realization should have devastated me. Instead, it felt like waking up from a long dream, painful but clarifying. I could see the path that had led me here, the series of compromises and accommodations that had transformed a loyal Imperial Guardsman into something that could process human suffering with mechanical efficiency. And for the first time since my capture, I had to decide whether that transformation was complete, or whether any part of Lysander Croak still existed beneath the efficient surface of 47. The convoy rolled on through the darkness between stars, carrying its cargo of violence toward humanity's most sacred worlds. And somewhere in the command section, in a private compartment earned through months of collaboration and compromise, a creature that had once been a man sat in comfortable chairs and wrestled with the ultimate question: what was the price of survival, and was any part of himself worth more than that cost? The answer would come soon enough, in the form of one final choice that would determine not just my fate, but whether anything human remained in the shell I'd constructed around the ruins of my former self. The weird boy's scream woke me from fitful sleep, a sound that seemed to tear through reality itself and set every piece of metal in the convoy vibrating in harmony. I'd heard him channel psychic energy before, during the rituals and battles that marked our progress across the galaxy. But this was different, not focused and controlled, but raw and chaotic, as if something fundamental had broken in the mechanism that contained the waagh's power. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red as I stumbled from my quarters, trying to understand what was happening. Through the command vehicle's armored viewports, I could see the rest of the convoy in chaos. Vehicles careening off course, slaves running in panic, orcs bellowing contradictory orders as they tried to maintain some semblance of control. At the center of it all was the Weird Boy's transport, a massive platform that served as both vehicle and mobile shrine. Psychic energy crackled around it like green lightning, and I could hear his voice echoing across the entire convoy, no longer speaking in the crude orcish dialect, but in something older and more primal. "Day warp calls," his voice thundered, seeming to come from inside my own skull. "Day great enemy stirs! Day time of endings is upon us!" The implications were immediately clear to anyone with knowledge of orc psychology and warp phenomena. The Weird Boy was losing control, his mind overwhelmed by psychic energies that exceeded his ability to channel them safely. If the process continued, the resulting explosion would consume not just his transport, but potentially the entire convoy. "Emergency protocols," bellowed Warboss Scarjaw, his voice cutting through the chaos. "All non-essential personnel to a minimum safe distance. Prepare for catastrophic warp breach." I should have followed orders. Should have evacuated to the rear of the convoy with the other administrative personnel, leaving the crisis to be handled by specialists with proper training and equipment. It was the logical choice, the safe choice, the choice that would ensure my continued survival and value to the organization. Instead, I found myself running toward the Weird Boy's transport. I couldn't explain the impulse, couldn't rationalize it in terms of operational efficiency or career advancement. It was as if some buried part of my mind had taken control, driving me toward a situation that offered nothing but pain and almost certain death. Perhaps it was the ghost of Lysander Croak, making one final attempt to reclaim what was left of his former self. The transport was a nightmare of twisted metal and psychic discharge when I reached it. Most of the grot attendants were dead, their small minds unable to cope with the energies flowing through the vehicle's systems. The Weird Boy himself was suspended in the center of a crackling maelstrom, his body convulsing as power beyond his control tore through his nervous system. But he was still conscious, still aware. And when he saw me approaching, his eyes, now glowing with eldritch fire, focused on my face with desperate intensity. "Umi!" he screamed, his voice distorting through octaves that shouldn't have been possible. "You understand, you see the truth, help me contain the storm." I understood then. The psychic energies weren't just random discharge. They were visions, prophecies, glimpses of possible futures that were tearing his mind apart with their implications. And somehow, my presence was stabilizing the flow, allowing him to focus the chaotic energies into something resembling coherent thought. "What do you see?" I shouted over the howling of tortured reality. "The end," he replied, his mechanical augmentations sparking and smoking as they tried to process information that exceeded their design parameters. "All of it, the great devouring, the final silence, the moment when the last light goes out." More visions flooded through the psychic link that had somehow formed between us. I saw the waagh, consuming world after world, growing stronger with each victory until it became an unstoppable force of destruction. I saw the Imperium's defenses crumbling, Space Marine chapters falling one by one, entire sectors going dark as the green tide rolled over them. But I also saw something else, a choice point, a moment when the outcome could still be influenced. The convoy's current course would take it to the staging area for the assault on Terra's outer defenses. But there was another route, one that would lead to a system where Imperial forces were massed for a counterattack. A route that would turn the waagh strength against itself. The navigation cogitators, the weird boy screamed. Change the course. Send us to T.O. He couldn't finish the sentence. The effort of maintaining coherent thought while channeling such massive energies was breaking down his ability to communicate. But I understood what he was trying to say, and more importantly, I understood what it would mean. Changing the course would drive the convoy into a trap. The Imperial forces massed in the alternate destination weren't there by accident. They were bait for exactly this kind of operation, positioned to destroy any orc force foolish enough to attack them directly. The waagh would be shattered, its leadership eliminated, its massive war machine reduced to scrap and corpses. Millions of orcs would die. Billions of enslaved humans would die with them. The entire carefully constructed hierarchy that had given my life meaning and purpose would be obliterated in a few hours of concentrated violence. But the assault on Terra's defenses would never happen. The shrine worlds and fortress systems that protected humanity's birth world would remain intact. Countless innocent lives would be spared the horror of orc conquest. All I had to do was access the navigation systems and input new coordinates. The weird boy's psychic storm would provide cover for the sabotage, making it appear as if the course change was the result of warp interference rather than deliberate action. By the time anyone realized what had happened, it would be too late to correct. I could save the Imperium. I could strike a blow against the darkness that would be remembered for millennia. I could redeem every compromise, every collaboration, every betrayal that had brought me to this moment. All it would cost me was everything. Choose, the weird boy screamed, his body beginning to tear apart as the psychic energies overwhelmed his physical form. Choose what you are. Choose what you want to be. The navigation console was just meters away, its displays flickering with electromagnetic interference from the psychic storm. I could reach it in seconds, input the new coordinates, and seal the waagh's fate. It would be the easiest thing in the world, but it would also be suicide. When the trap was sprung and the convoy destroyed, I would die with everyone else. The comfortable life I'd built, the security I'd earned, the position I'd carved out in the hierarchy, all of it would be lost. I would become just another casualty in humanity's endless war against the darkness. And for what? Abstract principles about duty and honor that had never protected me when I needed protection. Loyalty to an imperium that had forgotten I existed the moment I was captured. Solidarity with a species that had shown me nothing but brutality and indifference. The rational choice was obvious. Maintain the current course, allow the assault on Terra's defenses to proceed, and preserve the life I'd worked so hard to build. I was valuable to the waagh, essential to its operations. My death would serve no purpose beyond satisfying a conscience I'd already learned to live without. But as I stood there, surrounded by the chaos of the psychic storm, I found myself thinking about Captain Eleanor Voss, about her final words. I'm sorry that you chose to let them. Chose. That was the key word, the one that cut through all the rationalizations and justifications I'd constructed around my actions. Every step along the path that had brought me here had been a choice. Every compromise, every collaboration, every small betrayal of my former principles, all choices. I had chosen to survive at any cost. I had chosen to adapt rather than resist. I had chosen to become something that could thrive in the green hell of the waagh, regardless of what that transformation required. But I could still choose differently. My hands were shaking as I reached for the navigation console, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what I was about to do. For the first time since my capture, I was going to make a choice, based not on survival or advancement, but on something larger than myself. The new coordinates input smoothly, accepted by systems that were too busy compensating for warp interference to question their authenticity. Within seconds, the entire convoy began altering course, billions of tons of war machinery turning toward a destination that would become its grave. "Done!" the weird boy screamed, his voice already fading as the psychic storm began to consume him. "The choice is made. The path is set. The end is..." The explosion, when it came, was visible from orbit. The weird boy's physical form couldn't contain the energies he'd been channeling, and when his nervous system finally failed, all that power had to go somewhere. His transport simply ceased to exist, replaced by a brief star that illuminated the convoy for several seconds before fading to nothing. I should have been vaporized instantly. It should have been reduced to component atoms along with everyone else within a kilometer of ground zero. But somehow, impossibly, I was still alive, thrown clear by the initial shockwave, my body broken but intact, my consciousness fading but not yet extinguished. As I lay there in the wreckage, watching the convoy struggle to maintain formation after losing its spiritual center, I realized I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not the cold satisfaction of a job well done or the relief of survival, but genuine peace. The deep calm that comes from finally acting in accordance with your true nature. For the first time since my capture, I had chosen to be human. The trap was sprung 3 days later, exactly as the weird boy's visions had predicted. The massed Imperial fleet that had been waiting in the target system fell on the war, like the wrath of the God Emperor himself, turning space into a hellscape of lance batteries and Nova cannon fire. The convoy that had seemed so mighty, so unstoppable, was reduced to debris and bodies within hours. I watched it all from the medical bay where they'd taken me after the explosion, my broken body kept alive by crude orc surgery and industrial-grade pain suppressors. Most of the medical staff assumed I would die. Humans rarely survived the kind of injuries I'd sustained, but death seemed strangely reluctant to claim me. "Remarkable resilience," observed Doc Scarjaw during one of his visits. "Most impressive. Pity about the circumstances, really. You were one of our most valuable assets." Was. Past tense. My value to the organization had ended the moment I chose sabotage over collaboration, heroism over survival. If I lived through the current crisis, I would be just another expendable resource, useful only for the most basic labor until age or accident claimed me. But I found I didn't care. The position I'd worked so hard to achieve, the security I'd earned through systematic compromise, all of it had been built on a foundation of betrayal and moral cowardice. Losing it felt like shedding a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. The waagh didn't survive the trap. Oh, scattered elements escaped. Individual ships and warbands that managed to break through the Imperial fleet's encirclement. But the great war machine that had seemed destined to consume the galaxy was broken, its leadership eliminated, its momentum finally spent. Warboss Scarjaw died aboard his flagship, taking most of the senior command structure with him. Doc Scarjaw's transport suffered a direct hit from a Nova cannon, ensuring that his research into human weaponization died with him. Even the lesser orcs and grots who had made my life miserable were scattered to the void, their dreams of conquest becoming nothing more than expanding clouds of superheated plasma. The few survivors were rounded up by Imperial forces and processed according to standard protocols. The humans among us were separated for debriefing and eventual reintegration into the Imperium's population. Most would probably spend years in rehabilitation facilities, learning to be human again after their experiences in alien captivity. I never made it that far. The infection took hold during my 3rd week in Imperial custody, a consequence of the crude orc medical procedures that had kept me alive after the Weird Boy's explosion. My body, already weakened by months of malnutrition and abuse, simply couldn't fight off the alien pathogens that had been introduced along with the life-saving augmentations. But I wasn't afraid. Death held no terrors for someone who had already died once, symbolically, if not literally. The man who had been captured on Tertius Prime was long gone, replaced by something monstrous that had learned to find satisfaction in the systematic dehumanization of his own species. That monster had died in the psychic storm, choosing redemption over survival in the final moment when choice was still possible. What remained was just the echo of Lysander Croak, faint and fading, but real enough to face the end with dignity. In my final hours, as the infection spread through my system and my consciousness began its final retreat, I tried to compose some kind of testament, something that would preserve the lessons I'd learned, the horrors I'd witnessed, the terrible ease with which humans could be transformed into willing instruments of their own destruction. But words seemed inadequate to capture the reality of what I'd experienced. How could I explain to someone who had never been broken that the breaking was often a choice? How could I describe the seductive appeal of collaboration, the way it offered not just survival, but purpose and meaning in a universe that seemed designed to strip both away? In the end, I settled for something simple. A message scratched into the metal of my medical bed, using fingernails that had been strengthened by orc surgery, but guided by what remained of human will. Remember that you are human. Remember what that means. Remember that you always have a choice, even when it seems like you don't. Choose to remain human, no matter the cost. It wasn't much. Perhaps it wouldn't even be found, let alone understood by whoever discovered it. But it was all I had to offer, the final testimony of a man who had learned the price of survival and found it too high to pay. The machines around my bed began their death song as my vital signs faded, marking the end of a journey that had begun in the rubble of Tertius Prime and ended in an Imperial medical facility orbiting a world I would never see. But somewhere between those 2 points, in the chaos of a psychic storm and the moment of ultimate choice, Lysander Croak had returned from the dead long enough to remember who he was meant to be. It was enough. It had to be.